seen you in your dream. Oh, did you miss Freddy? Well, just remember, all you have to do is dream.
I can make you mine, taste your lips of wine anytime, night or day. The only trouble is, gee whiz, I'm dreaming my life away. I need you so that I could die. I love you so, and that is why whenever I want you, all I have to do is dream, 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 dream.
All you have to be seeing you.
A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, the novelization of the movie by Jeffrey Cooper. Chapter 1. Kristen Parker looked at the clock on her nightstand and lowered her voice. "He's so weird," she whispered into the telephone, glancing nervously at the door to her bedroom. Kristen never understood why her parents made such a big fuss about letting her use the phone late at night. It wasn't as if... "Kristen!" called the harsh voice from down the hall. "I gotta go," said Kristen. "See you tomorrow." She hung up the phone and switched on the radio just before her mother entered the room. "Your father and I are trying to get some sleep," said Mrs. Parker, glaring angrily at her teenage daughter. "It's just the radio." "Go to sleep," said her mother, saving Kristen the trouble of having to elaborate on her lie. "And stay off the damn telephone." The girl waited until her mother left the room before sticking out her tongue and making a terrible face. She sighed deeply and lay back on the bed. Sometimes she wondered if her parents would have been different if they didn't have so much goddamn money. She smiled grimly at the thought of all those kids at school who envied her because she lived in such a fancy home and always wore expensive clothes. If they knew what it was really like to be Kristen Parker. Kristen turned off the light and closed her eyes, only half listening to the announcer on the radio as he droned on about the talk show that was scheduled for later that evening. "And the suicide rate among 15 to 19-year-olds has increased by an astonishing 20%. Why are our children killing themselves, and what can we do about it? Join us on talk radio." But Kristen never heard the station's call letters, nor found out when the program would be on. In a few seconds she was fast asleep, and it was not until she felt the breeze in her hair and noticed the leaves falling on her face that she opened her eyes. Kristen was not in her room anymore. She was still in her own bed, all right, but her bed was now out in the middle of a deserted street. Kristen climbed out of bed and found herself looking at an old house she vaguely remembered seeing in a dream before. The house on Elm Street. "Mother?" she whispered, not really expecting a reply. And then she heard the children's voices. She stepped closer and saw them, dressed in their finest party clothes, as they jumped rope in front of the old house. The tune they were singing was strangely familiar, and Kristen wondered where she ever could have heard those strange words before. "What is this place?" asked Kristen. One of the little girls looked up while the others scattered. Kristen repeated her question. but the little girl just giggled and climbed onto a shiny red tricycle that stood in one corner of the cluttered lawn. With an eerie laugh, the girl pedaled into the house at incredible speed and disappeared. For reasons she couldn't possibly have explained, Kristen opened the door and stepped inside. Startled by the harsh clanging of a wind chime, she looked up at the 4 metal tubes hanging in the doorway. For a split second, they looked exactly like 4 long, straight razors. "Hello?" she said. The house was dark, but Kristen could see by the moonlight shining through the broken windows that the room in which she now stood was completely empty, except for a few dead leaves on the floor. Then she heard a metallic whirring noise coming from one of the back rooms. She stepped farther into the home and opened a large pair of sliding doors that she hadn't noticed when she first came in. The huge room was filled with hundreds of twisted tricycles, like some obscene parody of an automobile graveyard. Kristen had barely noticed that the floor was awash with blood when a large, riderless bicycle rolled up into the room. It was a bicycle built for 2, with bloody spikes where its seat should be, and 2 glistening straight razors for handbrakes. And then she saw him in the shadows, the man in the red and green sweater. There was a grotesque grin on his burnt face as he crooned to her in a horrible, throaty voice that no songwriter on earth could ever have imagined, except perhaps in her worst nightmare.
Kristen! Kristen! Give me your answer. I'm half crazy.
Kristen began to run, screaming as she descended what seemed to be an endless stairway, hurtling as fast as she could through the darkness to put as much distance as possible between herself and the terrible man at the top of the stairs. At last she came to the bottom of the stairs and staggered through a narrow doorway, gasping for breath. She flipped on the light and saw the bodies of 100 teenagers hanging lifelessly from the rafters, their eyes wide open and their purple tongues lolling obscenely from their mouths. Kristen screamed and turned around, crashing into the man with the red and green sweater. He was laughing triumphantly now as he held her in his arms, the razors at his fingertips cold against her neck. "I have to wake up," she said out loud, determined not to join the gallery of death in the room behind her. "I have to wake up!" And then Kristen was alone in her room. She jumped out of the bed and stared at herself in the bedroom mirror, through tears of fear and anger and frustration. For just a moment, she imagined the horrible man with the burnt face creeping up behind her, putting his terrible hands on her shoulders. She knew he wasn't really there, that he was trapped in the dream she had barely managed to escape. But the mere thought of the evil creature with the razor-tipped glove was suddenly more than she could bear. Kristen picked up a heavy paperweight from her dresser and heaved it at the mirror, shattering it into a dozen pieces. Then she fell to her knees, picked up the sharpest piece of glass she could find, and slashed it violently across her wrists. Dr. Neil Guinness paused at the nurse's station and greeted the burly black orderly who stood there watching a local news report on the epidemic of teenage suicides. "How's it going, Max?" asked the young psychiatrist. "All quiet on the Western Front," the orderly replied. Max had been on night duty at the adolescent ward all that week, and he often thought he would have quit his grueling job at Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital long ago if it weren't for a few good doctors like Neil Guinness. "How's Kincaid today?" asked Neil. Max shrugged and shook his head from side to side. "He's in the quiet room," he said. Neil nodded and headed for the quiet room. He had never fully approved of strapping disturbed adolescents into the big metal chair bolted to the floor, but he had to accept the unpleasant fact that sometimes patients had to be forcibly restrained for their own protection. Still, he was constantly arguing with Dr. Madalena about what he considered to be her excessive use of the quiet room. Come to think of it, he reflected with a grim smile, he seemed to argue with Dr. Madalena about damn near everything these days. How that woman with her antiquated ideas ever came to run a modern institution like Weston Hills was something Neil never expected to understand. Neil peeked in through the mesh grid window of the quiet room and studied the boy struggling to escape from the heavy leather straps that bound his wrists and ankles to the steel chair. Sometimes it was hard to remember that Kincaid was just a 17-year-old boy, standing well over 6 feet and weighing something in excess of 250 pounds. Kincaid gave off an aura of menace even in his gentlest of moods. The fact that his bullet-shaped head was completely devoid of hair only contributed to the notion that this was someone you would be wise to avoid running into on a dark street corner. Neil was about to open the door to the quiet room when he felt an icy hand on his shoulder. "Not now, Doctor," said the hard voice of Dr. Madalena. "We've just managed to calm him down." Neil glanced at his boss for a moment and then looked back at the boy inside the room. He had specifically asked Dr. Madalena not to medicate his patients unless absolutely necessary. But the older psychiatrist's notion of necessity seemed to differ consistently from his own. Sometimes Neil had the feeling that his boss was going out of her way to goad him into a showdown that they both knew he could not win. Neil was determined to put off the inevitable bit of unpleasantness for as long as possible. The kids needed him after all, and he was prepared to put up with a lot of bullshit, if it meant keeping his job at Weston Hills. "I imagine you've heard about the new assistant," said Dr. Madalena, leading Neil away from the quiet room and into the doctor's lounge. I heard some kind of rumor about help from downtown," said Neil, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It's more than just a rumor, I'm afraid," said Dr. Madalena. "Some of the parents have been complaining about the way we do things around here, and the city council decided we needed some community input." "I just don't like the way this makes any of us look," said Neil in an uncharacteristic burst of anger. "We're all professionals around here. Don't credentials and experience count for anything in medicine anymore?" "Perhaps in medicine," said Dr. Madalena with a deep sigh, "but not in politics, which is what this ultimately boils down to. Anyway, there's nothing any of us can do at this point. The cavalry is on its way, and we'll just have to wait and make the best of an unpleasant situation. I'm sure she won't get in anybody's way." "She?" Before Dr. Madalena could elaborate, Max came running into the lounge. "We got another one in the ER!" he shouted. Neil and Dr. Madalena instantly jumped up and raced toward the emergency room. "Her name's Kristen Parker," explained the nurse, struggling to hold down the girl, who violently resisted efforts to staunch the flow of blood from her torn wrist. "Get away from me, you bastard!" the girl screamed, her eyes glazed and her features contorted in fear and disgust. Max rushed to Kristen's side, using his considerable mass to steady the girl, while one of the doctors attempted to stitch up her bloody wrists. Suddenly the girl twisted away, throwing Max across the room with the force that seemed to belie the considerable difference in their sizes. Flinging herself into the corner of the room, she knocked a tray of instruments to the floor and picked up a large pair of surgical scissors. From the way she held the scissors in front of her, no one in the room doubted that she would skewer the first person who dared to come near. Neil prayed that the girl would not decide to turn the scissors on herself. "No one's going to hurt you," he said, taking a tentative step forward. Kristen jabbed at him with the scissors, and he quickly stepped back. Neil stood there helplessly as the girl began to rock slowly from side to side, eerily singing to herself in a weak and trembly voice. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. 7, 8, better stay up late. 9, 10. Suddenly Kristen stopped and stared at the figure who had just appeared in the doorway.
"Never sleep again,"
said the voice of Nancy Thompson, completing Kristen's rhyme. Neil turned to see the young woman framed in the doorway, her eyes locked on those of Kristen Parker. Suddenly, Kristen stopped rocking, and her eyes cleared as she let the scissors drop to the floor. Suddenly drained of energy, the girl fell to her knees and began to cry. The doctors immediately rushed to her side, meeting with no resistance, as they hastily treated her wounds.
"Who taught you that rhyme, Kristen?"
demanded Nancy, but the girl just sat on the floor staring at Nancy, as if suddenly rediscovering a long-lost friend. The cavalry has arrived, thought Neil Guinness. Chapter 2. What was that all about? Asked Neil as he sat across from Nancy at the cafeteria table. Nancy took a sip of hot black coffee and shrugged her shoulders.
"Just an old nursery rhyme. Something kids use to ward off the boogeyman."
You believe in the boogeyman? Asked Neil.
"Maybe,"
said Nancy with a smile. She was enjoying their flirtatious banter, especially after the tense scene in the emergency room. It had been a long time since Nancy had felt this comfortable with a man. She began to think about the first time she kissed Glenn at the sophomore dance. Then she forced herself to return to the present. There was something about this handsome young doctor that made her want to tell him things she had not talked to anyone about for many years. Nancy was very glad that her professor had used his influence on the city council to get her this position at the hospital. When she decided to go for a degree in psychological counseling after what happened on Elm Street, Nancy swore that she would do whatever she could to help other young people in trouble. Getting this job at Weston Hills in the middle of a teenage suicide epidemic was like the answer to her prayers, and meeting Neil Guinness was like icing on the cake.
"Tell me, Dr. Guinness."
"Call me Neil," he said with a smile.
"Neil,
She said, returning the smile.
what do you think is going on around here?"
Neil considered a wisecrack and then thought better of it. "It's hard to say," he replied with a shrug of his broad shoulders. "It could be environmental, maybe drug-related."
"None of the kids, victims or survivors, was using drugs."
"There's a reason for everything," said Neil, a slight tone of annoyance creeping into his voice. He was beginning to like this young woman very much, but he didn't much like being reminded that he didn't have a clue as to why young people were suddenly killing themselves off in unprecedented numbers.
"I'm sure there's a perfectly logical explanation,"
said Nancy soothingly.
"I just can't figure out what the hell it could be."
"You know, I used to work in a veterans hospital," said Neil. "There's something called delayed stress syndrome that you see a lot of in those kind of places, and it closely resembles what these kids seem to be going through."
"Shell shock?"
asked Nancy. "In a manner of speaking, it's like they've been in some sort of heavy combat, and they can't quite figure out how to deal with it."
"Combat,"
echoed Nancy. "Right," said Neil, feeling vaguely annoyed by the imprecision of his diagnosis. "The vets get better eventually, and, these kids will too,"
"I wouldn't count on it."
said Nancy. "Is that your professional opinion, Doctor?" asked Neil sarcastically. Nancy looked him in the eye and saw that this was neither the time nor the place to tell him her own admittedly bizarre-sounding theory of what was going on.
"I'm tired.
She said.
We'll talk more in the morning."
"Whatever you say," replied Neil. As Nancy was getting up to leave, she said,
"One more thing. Do any of the kids have nightmares?"
"It's funny you should ask that, actually," said Neil, caught off guard by Nancy's perceptive question. "I've hooked them up to the EEG machine, and none of them seems to have REM sleep."
"You mean?"
"They don't dream," said Neil, nodding his head. "I almost get the impression they're afraid to dream." Nancy was about to tell Neil something very important about her own experience in the world of dreams when she accidentally knocked over her purse. Neil bent down to help her pick up the spilled contents and paused over a bottle of large yellow pills. Hypnosil 60 milligrams read the label. Nancy snatched the bottle out of his hands and put it back in her purse.
Good night, Doctor,
she said, suddenly feeling more than a little uneasy. Good night, he said. He waited until Nancy was out of sight before taking a pad out of his jacket pocket and jotting down the name of her medication. Neil had to look in the latest supplement to his pharmaceutical reference book to find any mention of Hypnosil. It read, experimental, caution the text, effective for the management of the manifestations of psychotic disorders, possibly effective for sedation where dreamless sleep is considered optimal, and for suppression of night terrors. Neil closed the book and made a mental note to remember that all of Nancy Thompson's observations about mental health did not necessarily come out of an introductory psych book. Kristen Parker went to sleep that night clutching a crucifix tightly to her chest. She had never considered herself especially religious. The Parker family had always gone to church on the major holidays and given generously to all the right charities, but somehow the discussion of spiritual matters had never been a central feature of the family's religious life. Still, Kristen clung to the belief that there had to be something out there bigger and more important than just our brief lives on this tiny planet, tucked away in an obscure corner of the galaxy. She had never been able to share her mother's disdain for people who espoused unconventional religious viewpoints. Whether they chose to call the universal life force Allah or Tao or the great Hunkamunka, Kristen figured everybody was basically talking about the exact same thing. As she began to get sleepy, Kristen glanced at the tiny figure on the crucifix and wondered if Christ had suffered as she herself was now suffering. She closed her eyes, feeling warm and secure in her confidence that God, whatever she might turn out to be, was watching over her as she slept. And while Kristen slept, the figure on the crucifix began to writhe in pain, its eyes glowing red like two tiny hot coals. Kristen awoke suddenly to the sound of a squeaky wheel. She looked across the room and saw a tricycle slowly melting, as if from some intense inner heat. Kristen climbed out of bed and walked through the door, knowing even as she did so that she would soon be back in that strange house that haunted her dreams every night. The house on Elm Street. And she knew too that she had to pass through that all too familiar living room until she found the cellar door, and that she would open the cellar door and that he would be there as he always was, as large as life and 10 times as ugly.
Kristen, did you cross yourself today?
Asked the man with the burnt face, leering at Kristen as he crossed himself with his razored glove, blood and pus oozing from his rotting skin. Kristen began to scream, the man in the striped sweater just a few steps behind, as she ran up the stairs in terror. And then she was alone in a dark corridor. There was a doorway at the end of the hall, and Kristen felt compelled to step inside the simply furnished room. She only took one step before sinking through the room's liquid floor, gasping for breath as the furniture somehow remained suspended on the unsolid floor above her. She swam with difficulty to the surface, grabbing hold of a chair as her head broke the surface. She only had time to take one quick breath before a razored hand shot up from somewhere below, pulling her back into the murky waters. Kicking and squirming, Kristen broke free, and with a tremendous burst of will struggled to solid ground. And then the creature reappeared from beneath the water, only now it took the form of a horrible serpent, with the leering face of the man in the red and green sweater. "Help me!" cried Kristen, as the disgusting creature cornered her at the end of the upstairs hallway, its razor-sharp fangs already closing over her ankles. "Nancy!" Nancy was sitting up in bed writing in her diary when the pen suddenly jumped out of her hand and the diary went flying across the room. She barely had time to wonder what was going on before she was pulled down into the center of her bed, only to crash through an enormous mirror in her old house on Elm Street. Nancy scrambled to her feet and looked around. What in the world was she doing in her old house? And then she heard Kristen's screams. Without a moment's hesitation, Nancy ran down a seemingly endless series of corridors until she found the screaming girl swallowed up to her neck by a giant serpent with the face of Freddy Krueger. The huge snake stopped swallowing for just a second to study Nancy with its watery yellow eyes. A smile seemed to play across its wide, leathery lips.
What am I doing here?
Screamed Nancy in frustration as she clawed angrily at the creature's burnt face with her fingernails. "You're in my dream," gasped Kristen helplessly. I brought you here to help me,"
Then wish us out of here.
said Nancy, jamming her thumb hard into the creature's eye. Kristen nodded and took a deep breath just as Freddy's dislocated jaw began to close over her face. "I wish we were back in our own beds," she said, and as Freddy's jaws closed on empty air, Nancy found herself plummeting into the safety of her own bed. She looked around warily and saw the open bottle of pills on her nightstand. With a sudden intense fury, she picked up the bottle and hurled it violently against the wall.
Damn pills don't work anymore.
She said, collapsing on the bed in tears. It wasn't until she buried her face in her hands that she noticed the charred shreds of burnt human flesh that still clung to her fingernails. Chapter 3. Nancy didn't especially like Kristen's mother, and she knew at once that the feeling was certainly entirely mutual. What was it about people with money that made them so insensitive to their children's needs? Of course, Nancy knew it wasn't fair to overgeneralize in a case like this. She had known rich people before, who were excellent parents too, but there seemed to be a whole lot of people out there like the Parkers, who seemed to think that buying expensive presents for their kids was all it took to qualify them for Parent of the Year. "Frankly," said Mrs. Parker, quickly signing the hospital admitting forms that Nancy had brought to her home, "I can't help thinking that this whole thing has been blown way out of proportion. Kristen has always been a child who sought attention, and now she's got it, doesn't she? Well, she's not going to get it from me,"
I'm sure of that.
muttered Nancy. "Pardon me?" asked Miss Parker.
Nothing. Was Kristen acting any different before she made the attempt on her life?
"Not that I'd noticed. But then I've been rather busy lately." Mrs. Parker sighed and straightened a cushion on her exquisite leather couch. "After all, one has one's responsibility to one's community, hasn't one?" Nancy clenched the arm of her chair and refrained from answering the woman's rhetorical question. This was neither the time nor the place to lecture Mrs. Parker on where her primary responsibilities lay.
Did she have any nightmares that you know of?
Nancy asked. "Only when I took away her charge cards," Mrs. Parker replied with an unpleasant smile. "I really don't see what you want from me."
What I want from you?
Nancy stopped herself and took a deep breath.
I'm just looking for some answers. It's not just Kristen, Miss Parker. There's been other kids, good kids, with serious problems. I'm just trying to help them.
Before Mrs. Parker could reply, her husband abruptly entered the room. Nancy was sure that the well-tanned man in the expensive tennis outfit had been listening in from the next room. "It was nice of you to bring the papers here, Miss Thompson," he said. "But if everything is arranged for Kristen's stay in the hospital, we really must be getting to the club." "My first tennis tournament," said Mrs. Parker brightly.
How nice.
Said Nancy through clenched teeth. She checked the papers in her hand and saw that everything had been properly signed. There seemed no point in continuing the conversation.
Are Kristen's clothes ready?
"Why, of course," said Mrs. Parker. "Teresa said there was a suitcase ready in her room." Mrs. Parker called out for the maid, but there was no immediate reply. "Siesta time, I suppose," she muttered in disgust.
I'll go up and get it, if that's all right.
Said Nancy, curious to see Kristen's room. "Well, it's the first door on the left." Mrs. Parker gestured vaguely toward the stairs. Please be quick about it, though." Nancy nodded and walked briskly up the marbled stairway. Kristen's room looked very much like the room of any girl her age, with a casual warmth and sense of humor to it that was conspicuously absent from her mother's expensively furnished living room. Nancy picked up the fine leather suitcase from the bed and was about to leave when she noticed the model house on the table across from Kristen's bed. Then she blinked her eyes and looked again. The doll-sized house on Kristen's table was a perfect replica of Nancy's old house on Elm Street. Nancy stared at the house for a long moment before crossing the room for a closer look. Granted, there were a few small differences. The color was all wrong, and there was a tiny sign over the front door that read, "Hathaway House." Still, there was no doubt in Nancy's mind that this was an incredibly accurate scale model of the house she had lived in for most of her life. The house her mother had died in only a few short years ago when Nancy closed her eyes and forced herself not to think about it. She tucked the model under one arm, picked up the suitcase, and climbed back down the stairs.
Kristen asked me to bring this.
She lied. "Doesn't surprise us," said Mrs. Parker, now looking slightly ridiculous in her tennis whites. "The girl's been obsessed with that thing for weeks now. Frankly, I didn't even know she was interested in architecture." "There are a lot of things we both don't know about your daughter," thought Nancy, as she said goodbye and headed back to the hospital. "About those pills," Neil said as he walked with Nancy toward the group therapy room.
What pills are those?
She asked, although she knew exactly which pills he was referring to. "The Hypnosil," said Neil. Nancy shrugged.
What about them?
She asked, "Who prescribed them to you, Nancy? Do you understand? Did you know that they're still considered experimental?"
Don't worry about it. I'm not taking them anymore. Damn thing stopped working.
Before Neil could ask any more questions, Nancy joined Dr. Madalena and the kids from the ward in the group therapy room. She ignored the older woman's dirty looks and sat down on one of the chairs that had been arranged in a circle in the middle of the room. Nancy had never seen such a weary-looking group of teenagers before. "I hope to get to know each of you individually over the course of the next few days," said Neil, sitting down in the last of the empty chairs. "You all know Dr. Madalena, of course. Now, the young lady to my left is our newest staff member, Nancy Thompson. My name is Neil. Before we get started, why don't we all just introduce ourselves?" "Fuck this," said Kincaid, leaning forward belligerently in his chair. "Do you have a middle name, or do we just call you Mr. This?" asked Neil. Everyone laughed, and even Kincaid seemed to relax a little. "Kincaid," he said, leaning back with a grin.
"My name is Turin."
Said a pretty 15-year-old girl with chocolate-brown skin.
"I am fire."
"In this kingdom, I am called Laredo," said the boy sitting next to her. "Here, I am flesh. There, metal, rope, and ectoplasm." "Jennifer," said a blonde girl of about 16. Neil found her brief answer curiously refreshing. He waited a moment for the withdrawn-looking boy sitting next to Jennifer to speak, and then asked him his name. "That's Joey," said Jennifer. "He doesn't talk. He used to be a debater in school, but he hasn't spoken to anyone since he's been here." Neil nodded and turned to the last boy in the group, who identified himself as Philip. I walk in my sleep," the boy added. He opened his mouth as if he were going to say more, but then shook his head and looked away. "Well, it's good to meet all of you," said Neil. "I know it's late and we're all tired, But I'd like to try an experiment before we call it a night. Has anyone ever been hypnotized? More bullshit, said Kincaid. Does it scare you, Kincaid? Asked Neil. Nothing scares a brother of the dream, said Laredo. Neil smiled weakly and nodded his head. You've all had bad dreams, he continued, and it's my belief. I think some of you are having trouble remembering exactly what the dreams have been about. If we can just get a handle on your nightmares, I'd like to try, said Kristen. Good, said Neil, glancing briefly at Dr. Madalena before continuing. I'd like you to close your eyes now, Kristen. Just listen to my voice and relax. Forget about everything but the sound of my voice. Let the walls of the room fall away. There's nothing here but you and the sound of my voice. Now, as you begin to relax, I want you to remember. Remember what happened before you tried to hurt yourself. I'm going to start counting backwards from 5 down to 0. And when I reach 0, I want you to tell me exactly what happened that day. Kristen nodded, her breathing slow and regular. Okay, Kristen, I'm going to start counting now. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I'm doing my homework, said Kristen, her eyes now lightly closed and her features perfectly relaxed. It's late and I'm really tired. I fall asleep and now I'm in the dream. I can see the house. There's a terrible smell. Go on, said Neil, surprised to see that the others had also closed their eyes and were nodding in agreement. It's his face, said Kristen, her voice trembling slightly. It's all burned and scarred, and he's after me. He says he's going to hurt me real bad. I won't let him. I'll wake up. Listen to me, Kristen, said Neil, alarmed by the terror in the girl's trembling voice. I'm going to count backwards again. He's hurting the children, shouted Kristen.
I'll get him.
Said Terran, her eyes shut tight.
I'll burn him with my fire.
I need help, shouted Jennifer. Don't worry, said Laredo. With my golden sword shall I slay the wicked one. Grab onto my legs, said Kincaid, his eyes still closed as he leaped to his feet. I'll fly us to safety. Look out for the claw, warned Philip. Motherfucker! Screamed Joey, diving across the room at some invisible assailant. Nancy watched in silence as Neil and Dr. Madalena attempted to restore some semblance of order. It wasn't until Kristen abruptly vomited that the spell seemed to be broken. In that instant, all eyes opened, and the 6 young people fell back to their seats, totally exhausted. Nancy had the strangest feeling that she could have helped them, if only she had dared to close her own eyes.
Are you okay?
Whispered Nancy. Kristen sat up in her hospital bed and nodded her head. Getting better, she replied, speaking softly so as not to disturb Terran, who slept peacefully in her bed across the room.
I brought you something from home.
Nancy sat the model house down on the girl's nightstand. Kristen looked at the model for a long moment before turning back to Nancy. Why did you bring that? She asked.
Why did you make it?
Answered Nancy. Kristen shrugged and averted her eyes. Maybe I want to be an architect, she said.
Maybe. But why this particular house?
I just made it up, said Kristen. It's not anything special. It's not a special house.
It's special to me.
Said Nancy.
I grew up in this house. Right near here. On Elm Street.
Kristen stared at her in genuine bewilderment. "But this is the house I dreamed about," she said.
When did you first see it?
Nancy asked. "I've never seen it," said Kristen, "except in my dreams." Nancy stared at the girl for a very long moment, and then shook her head slowly from side to side.
I had a dream the other night.
Nancy began. "I know," said Kristen. "I meant to thank you for that."
Are you saying...
"It really happened," said Kristen. "I pulled you into my dream. That's my gift,"
your gift?
echoed Nancy, trying to make sense out of the girl's words. "All the kids have gifts," said Kristen. "I think that's why we've survived this long,"
Did you ever do anything like that before?
asked Nancy, still trying to grab on to the awesome implications of being pulled inside someone else's dream. "Just with my brother," said Kristen. "When I was little, sometimes I'd make him help me when I was having a bad dream. He never remembered anything in the morning, though. I was never really sure it had happened. That is, until now,"
The man who was chasing us.
said Nancy, her mouth suddenly very dry.
Have you dreamed of him before?
"I think so," said Kristen, paling slightly. "It's hard to remember,"
I know.
Nancy said as she gently placed a hand on Kristen's forearm.
Why do you keep dreaming? The others have stopped.
"I always thought I could get away," said Kristen. "Now, I'm not so sure,"
Do you think...
said Nancy, involuntarily tightening her grip on the girl's arm.
Do you think you could pull him out of a dream? The way you pulled me in?
"No way," said Kristen, suddenly releasing herself from Nancy's grip. "I don't ever want to see that creep again,"
I'm afraid
said Nancy with a sigh.
you may not have any choice about that.
Chapter 4. "You sure drink a lot of coffee," Neil said. Nancy shrugged as the waitress in the coffee shop refilled her cup.
Habit I got into
She hesitated.
when I was in high school. So, you have a private practice when you're not at the hospital playing savior?
"Sure," said Neil. "I interpret dreams at a local carnival."
They pay you in popcorn?
"Some. Mostly, I get $100 an hour."
People pay you to tell them about their dreams?
"Are you kidding?" Neil said, not noticing the serious tone that had crept into Nancy's voice. "For $100 an hour? I dream for them,"
That's a good idea.
said Nancy, staring off into the distance. "What's a good idea?"
Paying someone to have your dreams.
There was an awkward moment of silence before Neil spoke once again. "Anyways, your folks still live around here?" he asked.
My mom's dead.
Said Nancy a little too quickly.
She died in her sleep.
"I'm sorry," said Neil.
My father disappeared. Right around the time my mother died. I tried to find him for a long time. Traveled all over. Then I came back.
Nancy paused and looked Neil straight in the eye, and then she said.
I used to have bad dreams.
Neil nodded and took a sip of his coffee. Sometimes he wondered how people ever talked at all without coffee to sip during the awkward pauses between topics. "Dr. Madalena said you had some experience with kids who were hurting themselves?"
There was some trouble on Elm Street years ago. Some people died. Nothing on this scale, though.
Nancy looked up and put her hand on Neil's wrist.
Do you believe in other realities?
She asked. "You mean like the Wizard of Oz?" asked Neil with a grin.
Forget it.
Said Nancy, withdrawing her hand. "Hey, I'm sorry," said Neil, genuinely regretting his flippant remark. I was only joking."
Don't patronize me.
said Nancy angrily.
There are things I have to tell you about these kids. Important things.
Terrific, said Neil. Only, let's not talk here. Why don't we go over to my place, break out a bottle of semi-expensive wine, and have a serious talk?
I don't drink.
Said Nancy. Instant coffee, then? How's that sound? Nancy smiled in spite of herself. Neil Guinness could be infuriating, but Nancy didn't seem to be able to stay mad at him for more than a few moments at a time. It wasn't until they were at his house and she told him about the model that she found in Kristen's room that he really made her angry. "All right," said Neil, adding a carefully measured spoonful of sugar to his coffee cup. "For the sake of argument, let's suppose she never saw the house on Elm Street before, and somehow she builds a perfect model of the house you lived in when you were a kid. What does that prove?" He took a sip of coffee and shrugged his shoulders. "Maybe she'll grow up to be your real estate agent,"
You're not being funny.
said Nancy, deciding that perhaps the time had come to tell him the whole incredible story.
Something really amazing happened last night. While I was home in bed, Kristen was in the hospital having a nightmare.
"This is getting scary," said Neil with a big grin on his face.
You know something? You may have advanced degrees up the ass, but you don't know anything about people.
She jumped to her feet and started heading for the door. "Wait a minute," said Neil, chasing after her. I was only...
You don't really care about what's wrong with these kids. You just want to get everything under control, get your gold star, and go home.
"That's bullshit, Nancy, and you know it," said Neil. "I care just as much as you do. I just don't happen to think that it's such a great idea to start believing in my patient's delusions."
There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy, Neil Guinness.
"Okay," said Neil, reluctantly conceding the point. "Maybe I'm not always as open-minded as I could be. A person gets kind of cynical after a few years in med school. But I'm trying. Please, give me another chance, would you?" Nancy glared at him for a long moment, sighed deeply, and sat back down.
Pour me another cup.
She said. Most of the time, Max enjoyed working at Weston Hills. Not that being an orderly in a county mental hospital was the greatest job in the world. The pay was lousy and the hours were worse. Still, working at the hospital made Max feel as if maybe he were doing somebody some good, and that was more than he could say about any other job he had ever had in his life. Having Doc Guinness around made a big difference, too. The doc really cared about these kids, and he seemed to share Max's belief that you can't always go by the book. Helping the kids get better was the important thing, and rules and regulations were only there to be used or ignored, depending on what was best for the kids in that moment. Unfortunately, Dr. Madalena didn't seem to see things the same way. As far as Max could tell, the Dragon Lady believed that rules and regulations were the end-all and be-all of running an institution. If the kids had to suffer, so be it. Patients come and go, but the hospital is forever. Max felt like wringing Doc Madalena's scrawny neck sometimes when she treated the kids as though they were case studies in some kind of psychiatric textbook. Max never finished high school, but there was no doubt in his mind that he knew more about people than the Dragon Lady ever would, despite all her fancy degrees and diplomas. He sometimes wondered why God, in his infinite wisdom, gave people like Dr. Madalena the power to hire and fire honest, hard-working guys like him and Doc Guinness. Max tried not to worry about the world's many injustices that night as he made his evening rounds. Thinking of such things just made him angry. And more anger was the last thing these kids needed to deal with in their lives. Nighttime in hospitals is tough for everyone, and the kids and adolescents seemed to have it especially rough after lights out. To Max, sleep meant a welcome relief after a hard day's work, a time to set his problems aside and refresh himself for the new day to come. It was different for these kids, though. He had the feeling that they were all afraid to sleep, and he was sure Doc Guinness could help them if somebody could just figure out why. Until then, it was Max's job to make sure they all got through the night as best they could. "Lights out, gentlemen," he said, knocking lightly but firmly on the door to Joey and Laredo's room. "But Max," Laredo began to protest. "I know," said Max with a gentle smile. "You don't sleep. Well, neither does Doc Madalena, and she'll have my black ass in a sling if she comes around here and sees lights on after hours." Max felt a special fondness for these two kids. Joey couldn't have been more than 15, his body already frail and twisted like that of an old man. Laredo wasn't much older, but he always looked out for the younger boy, more like a big brother than a hospital roommate. What really amazed Max about Laredo, however, was his incredible imagination. Laredo seemed to dwell in a world of magic and fantasy, spending endless hours forging the tiny clay figures of wizards and kings and monsters that filled his side of the room. Max loved to listen in when Laredo entertained Joey and the others with his complex sagas of enchanted castles and fearless warriors. He was sure the boy knew the difference between reality and his own vivid imaginations, yet his magical tales were woven with such conviction that sometimes even Max forgot they weren't real. Joey's side of the room looked practically empty next to Laredo's. The only decorative item on Joey's nightstand was the remarkable model house that the Parker girl had given him. There was something almost frighteningly real about that house, Max thought, as if Kristen had been driven to reconstruct some actual house down to the last minute detail. "Max," said Laredo, interrupting the orderly's thoughts, "can I get my clay out of the arts and crafts room?" "Make it fast," said Max, nodding his head. Max didn't know exactly what was troubling Laredo, but he knew the boy needed to make his tiny clay figures to maintain his sanity. "Sweet dreams, Joey," said Max, gently mussing the boy's bushy hair. Then he turned off the light and moved on down the hall to Kincaid's room. The huge boy's frail young roommate, Philip, was already fast asleep. "Hey, Max," said Kincaid, nodding his head in Philip's direction. "I think the kid's starting to walk in his sleep again." "As long as he brings back coffee and donuts," said the orderly. Kincaid laughed as Max turned off the light. Max tried not to let the kids see him worrying, but sleepwalkers were actually one of his greatest concerns. Max couldn't be everywhere all the time, even if the Dragon Lady expected him to be. If a sleepwalker slipped past him one night and got himself hurt, Max didn't know what he would do. It was something he tried not to think about. Max was no longer worrying about sleepwalkers an hour later, as he sat in the staff lounge watching TV. Maybe if he hadn't been laughing quite so hard at Johnny's monologue that night, he might have heard Philip's soft footsteps as the boy lurched past the doorway behind him. He certainly would have noticed the stiff, unnatural way in which the boy was walking, like a poorly constructed marionette operated by an inexperienced puppeteer. Carefully, Max would have guided the boy back to bed, shut the door behind him, and made it back to the lounge before Johnny introduced his first guest. What he would not have seen was the leering figure of Fred Krueger guiding poor Philip every uncomfortable step of the way, his strong hands hooked under the boy's armpits, and his tattered shoes wedged beneath the boy's bare feet. Only Philip knew that it was the evil man in the filthy sweater who yanked him from his bed each night, forcing him to lurch awkwardly through the darkened hallways in his ill-fitting hospital pajamas. "Why?" the boy had asked the first time, nauseated by the dreadful stench of his tormentor's burnt flesh. "Why me?" "Why?" Freddy had replied, grinning as he drooled unconcernedly on the back of Philip's neck. "Because I like you!" Laredo was not asleep the night Freddy waltzed Philip past the doorway of the TV lounge. He had stayed longer than he had meant to in the arts and crafts room that night, and happened to peek out the door just as Philip lurched by. He was about to go to the boy and steer him back to his room when something very odd happened. For just one fleeting instant, Laredo thought he saw the man in the red and green sweater standing behind Philip. He blinked his eyes and took another look. The image had flashed by so quickly that Laredo didn't know whether he had actually seen someone or just imagined it. Laredo was well aware of his own overactive imagination, and he often thought of the weird man who used to haunt his nightmares. Back when he used to sleep at night, that is. They had seemed so real, and yet... And then he saw it again. It only lasted for a fraction of a second. But there was no doubt in Laredo's mind that Philip was not alone, especially after the boy passed through an unopened door. "Kincaid?" said Laredo, shaking the large boy out of his sleep. Kincaid opened one eye. "This better be good, man," he growled threateningly. Then he looked across the room and saw Philip's empty bed. "Come with me," said Laredo. Kincaid grumbled a few of his favorite obscenities and followed the smaller boy out into the hallway. They raced quietly down the corridor until they reached a window at the end of the hall. Philip was about to step off the curb in front of a speeding ambulance. "Leave him alone!" screamed Kincaid, punching his fist through the locked window, as the laughing man in the red and green sweater flung Philip in front of the on-rushing vehicle. "Look both ways!" Chapter 5. I want to talk about what happened to Philip last night. Neil looked around the room, wondering who would speak first. Philip's accident had affected the rest of the kids more powerfully than he had expected. None of them had seemed especially close to the boy in life, and yet they all seemed to be responding to his death as if it were some sort of personal insult. According to Max, every kid in the ward began crying and hollering at the moment of Philip's death. "He wasn't strong enough," said Kincaid, breaking the silence. The others nodded in agreement. "He couldn't handle it, so he got wasted." "He showed his weak side to the sorcerer," said Laredo, "so the evil one killed him." "Nobody killed Philip," observed Dr. Madalena. "He was a sleepwalker, and sometimes—" "Bullshit!" interrupted Kincaid. "The bastard murdered him!"
It's true. Kristen can tell you.
said Taryn.
Kristen, can you take us to him?
Said Nancy. Dr. Madalena glared at Nancy and then turned her questioning gaze onto Neil. Neil just shook his head and shrugged in bewilderment.
Kristen?
Repeated Nancy. "He's in the house," said Kristen, her eyes tightly shut. Joey began to tremble and buried his head in Kristen's lap. "He wants us to come." "Dr. Guinness," said Dr. Madalena, "I'd like to speak to you outside for a moment." Neil reluctantly followed Dr. Madalena outside. "I think we should increase their medication," she said when they were alone.
No!
Shouted Nancy, stepping into the hallway uninvited to join in on the conversation. "And why not, Miss Thompson?" said Dr. Madalena with a condescending smile.
Because it'll lower their defenses. They'll start dreaming again.
Answered Nancy. "Exactly," said Dr. Madalena. "That's probably all they need to release all this negative energy."
Neil?
Pleaded Nancy. Neil glanced at Dr. Madalena for a moment and then turned back to Nancy. "Studies do show that we all have to dream sooner or later," he said. "It's dangerous not to." Nancy glared at him furiously and then stalked back to the group therapy room. Neil wondered, not for the first time, if maybe the woman he loved belonged on the hospital's patient list and not on its payroll.
I think it's time you all knew who was trying to kill you.
said Nancy. The time had come at last to tell the kids the whole truth. Don't humor us, said Jennifer. When Nancy mentioned he wore a brown hat, all eyes were on her. When she mentioned the burned skin and the razors on his hand, she had their full attention. There was a complete silence in the room now, as Nancy took a deep breath.
His name is Fred Krueger. He's tough, but we can beat him if we work together. I know because I've been there.
What happened? Asked Kincaid. Nancy shrugged.
I thought I killed him. Apparently I was wrong. And now he's stronger than ever. He tried to kill all of you, as he killed the other so-called suicides. But you people are different. You have special powers in the dream world that you use to survive. You talked about your gifts a little,
She said, referring to the session when Neil had hypnotized Kristen.
Help us fight him.
Said Taryn. The others nodded.
I'll try. But you have to be willing to dream again. Otherwise, you'll really go crazy. And you'll have won by default. We're all going to have to face him again. But this time, we won't be alone.
Nancy explained. Lead us into battle, said Laredo, speaking for the group. Nancy said that Kristen could take them to him. Without a word, the others linked hands. Kristen closed her eyes, and someone began to chant. 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, sang someone else, and then they were all chanting together, no longer surprised that the others knew the song that each vaguely recalled from his or her own worst nightmare. 9, 10. Never sleep again. All eyes opened and looked around. Nothing seemed changed. Thanks a lot, said Kincaid sarcastically. We're here, said a deep and resonant voice none of them had ever heard before. They turned to see Joey standing straight and tall, a smile of profound joy on his face. In the dream, I am strong, he said, suddenly doing a cartwheel across the floor. Laughing, he strode over to Kincaid and lifted the larger boy into the air with one hand.
In the dream, I'm bad. And I'm fire.
Said Taryn. She turned away from the others, opened her mouth, and spewed out a great flame. Jennifer laughed and extended her hand in congratulations. When Taryn tried to shake it, her hand passed right through. In the dream, I can fade away, said Jennifer. It was Laredo's turn next to demonstrate his gift. He picked up a chair and pressed it to his chest. The chair turned into an accordion, and Laredo began to play a merry tune for the others as he danced for joy. Immediately, Kincaid rose into the air and floated over to Kristen. You brought us here? He asked, delighted with his gift of flight. It's my gift, said Kristen, to move in and out of the dream world and to take others with me.
You're all special in the dream. Together, you have the powers we need to beat Freddy once and for all,
said Nancy. We're invincible, boasted Jennifer. We are the warriors of the dream, said Laredo, his accordion suddenly changing into a sword.
It isn't going to be easy,
said Nancy.
I thought I killed the bastard years ago, but I was wrong. He's back, and it's going to take every ounce of courage we can muster to defeat him.
We're ready, said Kincaid, his feet just a few inches off the floor. Let the games begin, said Laredo. And then the door crashed open, and a few dead leaves blew into the room. Nancy and the others stepped outside to see a trail of slime leading around the corner of the corridor. And there, at the end of the trail, stood Freddy Krueger, a crooked grin on his leathery face. face.
Well, well, if it isn't the Brady Bunch.
Freddy raised his claw up in the air and swung it down at Jennifer. He seemed startled when the girl faded away and his hand passed right through her, throwing him off balance and sending him crashing into the wall behind her. He quickly staggered to his feet and rushed to Laredo. Again, his razored glove swooped down for the kill, but Laredo just reached out his arm to block the blow. Suddenly, the boy's arm was transformed into an anvil, and Freddy's blades sparked harmlessly as they crashed against the heavy steel. Without hesitation, Kincaid propelled himself into the air and locked his powerful legs around Freddy's thick neck. It was Joey who knocked the wind out of the creature with the hard punch to the stomach. Kincaid withdrew as Freddy staggered from the force of the blow, bewildered by the sudden strength of his opposition. Then Freddy saw Turin standing quietly to one side, and a look of wicked joy returned to his eyes.
Your turn to die, little girl,
he said, stepping toward her. Turin just smiled, opened her mouth, and set the startled creature on fire. The others began to applaud as Freddy wheeled around and around, trying in vain to escape the flames that engulfed him. He began shrieking in pain, his anguished cries suddenly turning into the piercing sound of a fire alarm. And then they were in the group therapy room again, just as Neil and Dr. Madalena rushed back inside. "Who set off that alarm?" asked Dr. Madalena, glaring suspiciously at Kincaid and the others.
Don't look at them.
Said Nancy with a half-smile.
They've been with me the whole time.
Dr. Madalena stared at her angrily and then left the room without saying another word. Neil looked at Nancy, shook his head slowly from side to side, and started to follow. "See you later, Doc," said Joey. Neil's jaw dropped open as Joey and the others strode boldly out of the room. "What the hell's going on?" asked Neil.
What do you mean?
Asked Nancy with feigned innocence. "The kids," said Neil. "They seem different." Nancy smiled.
Healthier?
She suggested. "I don't know. Maybe. All right, yeah, they seem healthier." Nancy paused just a moment for effect.
I took them on a field trip. Kids love field trips.
She said, and then walked out, leaving Neil to stare after her in complete bewilderment. Jennifer was having trouble sleeping since Kristen went home. The two girls had known each other only a few days, but a bond had been formed in that short time that was unlike any relationship Jennifer had known before. Kristen was the only one who really seemed to understand the hell that Jennifer was going through since the dreams began. Talking to Kristen, Jennifer sometimes felt as if maybe everything was going to work out all right in the end after all. If only she had met Kristen a few days earlier, Jennifer thought, maybe she never would have doused her clothes with lighter fluid and threatened to set herself on fire. "Got a light, Max?" she asked, encountering the burly orderly as she prowled the corridor. "Sorry." Max smiled and shrugged his broad shoulders. Jennifer's request for a light had become sort of a running gag between the two of them. Sometimes he was tempted to offer her a match just to see what would happen. Max sensed a kind of inner strength in the girl that made him doubt that she would ever really take her own life. "Anything else I can do for you?" Jennifer shook her head and sighed. "Can't sleep," she said. Max wished he had a nickel for every time he had heard that complaint over the past few months. "Why don't you go log a little tube time?" he suggested, nodding in the direction of the TV lounge. "It's after hours," said Jennifer. Max smiled and gave the girl a conspiratorial wink. "I won't tell anybody," he said. "Thanks, Max," she said. Jennifer had always enjoyed falling asleep in front of the TV at home, and it was one of the things she missed since being admitted to the hospital. She took a few steps toward the TV lounge and suddenly stopped. "Something wrong?" asked Max. "No," said Jennifer. After their encounter with Freddy, Nancy had warned the kids to stay together, for their own safety. For a moment, Jennifer considered going back to the room and getting Turin. But no, that would be silly. Her roommate was probably fast asleep by now. Besides, what possible harm could there be in watching a little late-night television? Jennifer walked down the hall to the lounge, tuned to an old movie, and settled herself comfortably in front of the set. Almost immediately, she felt herself become deliciously drowsy. She closed her eyes for just a second and leaned back in the overstuffed armchair. She opened her eyes a moment later to find that the picture had disappeared. "Damn," she said, getting up from her comfortable chair to adjust the set. Patients weren't supposed to touch the controls, but Jennifer didn't want to disturb Max after he had been nice enough to let her watch past curfew. She fiddled with the fine-tuning and impatiently spun the channel control knob, but the screen remained blank. "Damn," said Jennifer again, smacking the side of the TV with her tightly clenched fist. Just when she was starting to feel all cozy and sleepy, the damn set was on the blink. Jennifer tried to pound the side of the television again, but this time a hand came out of the side of the TV and clenched her fist in its iron grasp. Jennifer tried to pull away, but it was of no use. She was about to scream when a second hand reached out from the screen, its razor-tipped glove raised high in triumph. "Oh my God!" whispered Jennifer as the leering face of Freddy Krueger filled the screen in horrible close-up.
Here's Freddy!
He announced, laughing maniacally, as his two extended arms tightened their grip on the terrified girl. "Help me!" she screamed, but she knew, even as she opened her mouth, that no one would hear her.
"We've got a wonderful show for you tonight,"
said the face on the screen, a thick stream of drool oozing down its chin.
"It's a delightful little program we like to call You Asked For It. Oh, what's the matter? Aren't you excited? This is your big break in TV. Welcome to prime time, bitch!"
With that, Freddy's powerful arms jerked Jennifer forward, ramming her head through the TV screen with tremendous force, crushing her skull as the thick glass shattered and the picture tube imploded in a sparking, hissing mess of brain, glass, and glowing phosphors. Max found Jennifer's body a few seconds later, her bloody legs dangling limply from the front of the set. He managed to call downstairs for help before rushing to the bathroom to puke up his guts. Chapter 6.
Awful quiet around here.
Said Nancy, standing beside Max at the nurse's station. "Kids are pissed off about not going to the funeral," said Max.
Can't blame them.
Nancy had argued with Dr. Madalena for a long time about that one, but the woman just wouldn't listen to reason. "Rules are rules," she had said. Nancy wanted to tell her what she could do with her fucking rules, but had managed to restrain herself. "By the way," said Max, "I think I found out something about that house Kristen built."
Did you?
Nancy had mentioned to Max that she would be interested in anything he could find out about Hathaway House, but she hadn't really expected him to come up with anything. "I found this old picture in storage," he said, handing her a large frame photograph. Nancy stared in amazement at the old photograph. It was a picture of the house on Elm Street, as it might have looked half a century ago. A dozen or so nurses in starched uniforms were stiffly posed in front of the freshly painted structure. "Seems Hathaway House used to be some sort of a sanitarium back in the late 30s. Sort of a halfway house or something for mental cases. Moved to Weston Hills during the war." Nancy studied the photograph for a minute and then looked up at Max.
Is there anyone I can talk to who might know more about Hathaway House?
Max nodded and pointed at one of the nurses in the picture. "This lady here might be able to help you. Name's Miss Sapphire, just retired a few years ago. Lives in that old age home out just outside of town."
Thanks, Max.
Said Nancy, giving the surprised orderly a grateful peck on the cheek. Then she grabbed her jacket and took off for the old age home. Hathaway House, said Miss Sapphire. She took a sip of tea and leaned back in her chair. The first of its kind, in a way, sort of an experiment in the treatment of mental illness. Only took women with really bad problems.
Psychotics?
Asked Nancy. Miss Sapphire nodded. Only we didn't have any fancy names for it then. Possessed women, we used to call it.
How long did the place exist?
Oh, only a few years. A neighborhood started growing up around it, and people didn't much like having a house full of weird women so close by, you know. That's why the folks that ran the place moved it out of town.
To Weston Hills.
To Weston Hills, agreed Miss Sapphire. There was a long silence before Nancy asked her next question.
Did anything terrible ever happen at Hathaway House?
Miss Sapphire took another sip of tea and sighed. Many things, child, she said. Many things. The old woman opened the scrapbook that lay on the table beside the teapot and pointed to a picture of a pretty young woman. This one burned to death, she said, still in her teens when she came to us. 8 months pregnant, wouldn't you know? Transferred from the old county hospital. The snake pit, they used to call it.
Still do,
said Nancy. Miss Sapphire nodded and continued her story. The way I had heard it, the girl had been sold by the orderlies for $500 for the worst crazies to have their way with while the staff turned their backs. Doctor said she must have been raped 1,000 times before she got to Hathaway.
How did she die?
Asked Nancy. Died giving birth, said Miss Sapphire. The baby was huge, tore her right up. She was all alone and screaming for help when she knocked over an old gas lamp. Burned to death in her bed.
And the baby?
Burned pretty bad, but it lived. She paused and shook her head thoughtfully. Don't know what ever became of that boy. Nancy leaned across the table and looked at the woman's picture.
Pretty.
Pretty name, too, as I recall, said Miss Sapphire. Amanda it was. Amanda Kruger. Nancy lay in bed with her clothes on and tried to relax. This is dumb, said Kristen, sitting on the chair at the side of the bed.
Sorry,
Said Nancy.
but it's the best I could come up with.
I don't mean the idea, said Kristen. I mean going alone. I should go with you. We'd have twice as much power together. You said so yourself, Nancy.
Too dangerous. Besides, I need someone I can count on to stay awake.
She thought of Glenn once more and felt a sharp pain in her heart.
Just wake me up when it looks like I have the glove.
You've done this before, haven't you? Asked Kristen.
Quiet, please.
Said Nancy, ignoring the girl's question. She closed her eyes and started counting backward, very, very slowly.
10, 9, 8, 7.
And then she was on Elm Street. Nancy took a few tentative steps down the dark, tree-lined street. The house looked very far away, and Nancy found herself moving very slowly through the thick, still air. She became aware of a loud throbbing sound and realized it was her own heart. Suddenly, the idea of dropping in on Freddy unannounced and stealing his claw didn't seem quite so brilliant. Nancy picked up a heavy tree branch and moved closer to the house. She finally reached the porch and was about to go inside when something crashed to the ground beside her.
Kristen!
Cried Nancy, feeling a weird combination of anger and relief. I thought you might need some help, said the girl, not realizing how close Nancy had come to bashing her head in with the heavy branch.
I will need help.
Said Nancy.
I just don't know if you can give it to me from here.
I don't know either, but I couldn't just sit there and wait. Kristen looked around and took a deep breath. Any sign of the bastard yet? Nancy was about to reply when she heard the low, menacing growl of a very large dog. Both girls turned to face the beast, but the huge creature they saw was not like any dog either of them had ever seen before. The massive German Shepherd with the red and green striped fur had the leering, burned face of Freddy Krueger. Nancy and Kristen dashed into the house as the great beast lunged forward, a long string of thick saliva hanging from its half-human, half-canine jaws. The girls ran down a long, unfamiliar highway, while the creature crashed through the closed door. The sound of its raspy breathing seemed to fill the entire house.
The cellar,
Whispered Nancy, taking the younger girl by the hand and leading her down a seemingly endless stairway. There was a kind of hazy fog in the air, and Nancy proceeded cautiously through a large iron door to the old furnace.
This is where my mother hid the claw.
She said, pulling open the door to the firebox. "Help me!" said Jennifer, her head lodged awkwardly inside the firebox as maggots slowly but steadily devoured her bloody face. Nancy screamed and whirled around only to see Freddy, no longer in canine disguise, lashing out at Kristen with the razor-tipped glove he wore on his right hand. The blades cut deep, and a thin stream of blood began to flow from the girl's wounded arm. Nancy grabbed her by the other arm and pulled her away, dragging her up the stairs and into another winding hallway that seemed to lead nowhere. "Somebody please help us!" gasped Karen, her left arm throbbing painfully. She thought of the strongest person she knew and called his name out loud. Suddenly, Kincaid disappeared from his hospital bed and crashed into the corridor a few feet behind Freddy. Immediately, Freddy wheeled around and raised his claw, surprised but delighted by the unexpected arrival of a new victim. What he hadn't counted on, however, were Kincaid's keen survival instincts, honed to a fine edge by years of street fighting. It only took the huge teenager a fraction of a second to recognize the threat present in Freddy's gleaming blades, and that second was all the time he needed to plant his massive fist squarely between his assailant's eyes. "Joey," said Kristen, closing her eyes and picturing the boy in her mind, strong and graceful as he was in the world of dreams. "Laredo, Turin." And one by one the dream warriors slipped out of their everyday reality and answered Kristen's summons to the world of dreams. It was Joey who landed the next punch, his fist landing on Freddy's jaw with tremendous force as Kincaid floated away from the creature's downswept claw. "Way to go!" said Laredo, quickly accepting the bizarre fact that he was now inside someone else's dream. Without a moment's hesitation, Laredo joined his hands together as if in prayer. His hands seemed to fuse together and grow, turning first into a pair of large cymbals and then into a whirring buzzsaw. "Cover me!" he called to Turin, swiftly advancing on the cowering Freddy. The girl opened her mouth and spewed forth a great orange flame. But now Freddy was on his feet, and he loomed above the brave teenagers, 3 times his normal size, with claws like enormous razor-edged swords. Laredo stopped in his tracks and looked to the others for help. Nancy hollered for them to get out of there, knowing as does any good leader when it's time to sound retreat. She grabbed Kristen's good arm and the others all joined hands. "What about the claw?" asked Kristen. Nancy told her to forget the claw and to just get out of here. "I'll get it," said Joey, releasing Turin's hand to leap high into the air and kick the advancing giant hard in the chest. Freddy toppled to the ground, suddenly reverting to his normal size. Joey jumped on top of him and yanked the bladed glove off his right hand. "Get out of here!" he shouted, tossing the terrible claw to Nancy as Freddy began struggling to his feet. Kristen looked at the claw, now in Nancy's hand, for a split second and then closed her eyes. Suddenly, she was back at the hospital. A moment later, Nancy, Kincaid, Laredo, and Turin crashed to the floor beside her. Max raced into the room and immediately saw the blood on Kristen's arm. He was about to call for help when Dr. Madalena appeared. "What in the bloody hell is going on around here?" she demanded, surveying the scene from the doorway. "And what are you doing here?" she asked Kristen, apparently more disturbed by the girl's unauthorized presence in the hospital than by the bloody wound on her arm. Before Kristen could speak, Dr. Madalena turned her accusing eyes on Kincaid. "I swear to you, Kincaid, if you're responsible for all of this—"
"It was the man in the nightmare,"
said Kincaid. The others nodded their heads. Dr. Madalena looked from face to face and decided that further questioning at this time would be pointless. Besides, it had finally dawned on her that Kristen was in desperate need of medical attention. "Get her to the ER," she told Max, "and then call her parents and readmit her. The rest of you, get to bed immediately. And as for you," she said, turning to Nancy, "who the hell do you think you are to be playing dangerous games with my patients?" Dr. Madalena saw the bladed glove in Nancy's hand and yanked it away from her. "Maybe you'd like to explain this monstrosity to the police." Nancy opened her mouth to explain, but found she was too weary to even speak a word. "I want you out of here now, Thompson," said the dragon lady, her eyes glowing with hatred. "And if you ever dare set foot in here again, I will personally see to it that you're committed to this institution for the rest of your pathetic, natural-born little life." She turned and stalked out, leaving Nancy all alone to reflect on all that had happened. That's when it occurred to her that someone was missing, and she then said aloud that Joey was still back there.
"Come on out, Kruger,"
shouted Joey, never feeling so alone or helpless in his entire life. This isn't even my dream, he thought, waiting for Kristen to bring him back to whatever safe haven the others had retreated to.
"Come on,"
he shouted again with forced bravado.
"I'm your worst nightmare now, you ugly, burnt son of a bitch."
Slowly he walked down a long, dark hallway, prepared for Freddy to jump out at him at any moment. He saw an open door at the end of the hall and took a deep breath.
"Let's get this over with, Freddy,"
he said aloud as he stepped into the room. To Joey's delight, however, the figure reclining on the frilly pink bedspread bore no resemblance whatsoever to Freddy Krueger. "Hi, Joey," said the girl in the skimpy black negligee. "Remember me?"
"Beth Dorset?"
whispered Joey, too stunned to contemplate the improbability of it all. Beth had been the subject of Joey's most intense private fantasies ever since junior high school. The fact that she and her fancy friends always made fun of him hadn't deterred him from imagining almost daily what it would be like to hold the exquisite girl in his arms. "You've changed, Joey," said the girl, rising from the bed and moving toward him. "You're so handsome now, so sexy." Joey swallowed hard and tried not to stare at her lush cleavage. "Don't you like me anymore?" she pouted, the back of her hand softly caressing his reddening cheek. "Don't you want me, Joey?" "I know I want you." The bedroom door closed while Joey and Beth embraced, their kisses growing increasingly passionate as the girl plunged her tongue into the boy's open mouth. It took Joey a few seconds to realize that her thick tongue was growing rapidly, snaking deeper and deeper down his throat until he began to gag. He tried to let go, but she held him in an iron grip. Joey began screaming in agony as the serpentine tongue worked its way into his skull, popping out his right eye before doubling back to push his other eye deep into his hemorrhaging brain.
"You're such a good kisser,"
Freddy croaked, resuming his own horrible form. Joey toppled over, clutching at his empty eye sockets as he fell onto the dirty red and green striped bedspread. The four posts of the old bed suddenly came to life, four powerful arms grabbing each of Joey's limbs and pulling him tight as a rubber band, suspending him in midair above the stained mattress. His body stretched beyond the breaking point until it snapped into a sickening spray of blood and shattered bone. Back at Weston Hills, Kristen Parker had begun to weep uncontrollably. A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, the novelization. Chapter 7. "Where are you going?" asked Neil. He had to walk very fast to keep up with Nancy as she strode briskly across the hospital grounds.
I don't know. I just know I can't stay here anymore.
She replied honestly. "Why, because of Dr. Madalena? I'll straighten that out for you, Nancy. If I quit every time the Dragon Lady..."
It's not just her. There's something going on here that I can't handle anymore. I thought I could help these kids, but now I'm not sure I can even help myself."
Interrupted Nancy. "I think you've already started to help them, though," said Neil. "And I have a funny feeling maybe they've started helping you too, Nancy." Nancy stopped and looked at Neil. She swallowed hard. Maybe he was right. Maybe. Then she remembered Kristen's bloody arm and everything that had happened since she started working at Weston Hills. No, she was hurting these kids by staying here, and they had already endured more hurt than anyone deserved to endure in a lifetime.
"Give a girl a ride?"
Said Nancy. "Where to?"
"The bus station."
Neil looked at her for a long moment and then shrugged his shoulders. She followed him to his car, climbed into the front seat, and fell asleep. When she opened her eyes, they were pulling into Neil's driveway.
"I don't see any greyhounds."
Said Nancy. "I keep 'em in the bedroom," he replied. Nancy looked at Neil. Then she looked at the house for a moment and smiled.
"Show me,"
she said. They lay still in each other's arms for a long time before Nancy broke the silence.
"Have you ever thought of suicide?"
she asked. Neil sighed and shook his head. "Am I that lousy in bed? Geez," he asked. Nancy smiled and kissed him tenderly on the lips.
"As a matter of fact, you're incredible in bed. I guess my timing is just a little off."
"Your timing was perfect," said Neil with a big smile.
"You know what I mean."
Nancy gave him a playful slap on the arm. "Do you think about suicide a lot?" asked Neil, suddenly turning serious. Nancy shrugged.
"It's a way out, isn't it?"
"Yeah, for cowards, maybe."
"I don't think it's all that easy. If it were, a lot more people would do it."
Nancy paused and gazed thoughtfully at the ceiling.
The only reason I haven't killed myself already is that I have no guarantee you would leave me alone, even if I were dead."
"Who?" asked Neil, taking her face in his hands and turning it towards his.
"That man I told you about."
"Who, Kruger? But that's..."
"Crazy? You think I'm crazy, don't you?"
"Of course not," said Neil, but his answer came just a second too late.
"Let's go to sleep."
Nancy turned her back to Neil and almost immediately fell into a deep sleep. Nancy awoke moments later to the sound of a dripping faucet. She slipped out of bed and followed the sound to the bathroom. The faucet was dripping blood, and the basin was already filled with the scarlet liquid. Nancy closed the faucet and became aware of a louder dripping behind her. She turned and saw that the bathtub too was filled with blood that continued to spurt in thick globs from the faucet. She stepped forward to shut the leak and saw the faces in the shower curtain. "Help us!" they moaned. Nancy stared in horror at the faces of Philip and Jennifer, their dead eyes staring at her from somewhere beyond the thick white vinyl, their bloody faces pressed tight against the heavy fabric. "Kill him, Nancy, kill him," they said. "Kill him before he kills us all,"
"We've got his claws,"
said Nancy, desperate to believe that her terrible work was finally done. "Use them," said the voices. "Kill him by his own hand." She was about to speak when the curtain began to move, the curtain hooks making a horrible screeching sound as they scraped against the metal rod. It wasn't until she saw the bloody, clawed hand emerge from behind the curtain that Nancy began to scream. "What's wrong?" asked Neil, shaking her roughly by the shoulders as she sat up beside him in bed. Nancy's eyes snapped open. She stared in horror at the closed bathroom door, her heart pounding violently in her chest.
I have to go to the hospital right away,
said Nancy, certain now that she would never leave this place until the job she had begun on Elm Street was finally completed. I can't believe what you're telling me, said Neil, following Nancy down the corridor to Dr. Madalena's office. You're not talking about dreaming as any sane person knows it.
I'm talking about the dream as reality.
Said Nancy.
Dreams that you can touch, taste, feel, and even get killed in.
I'm sorry, that sounds like bullshit to me, said Neil.
Tell that to Philip and Jennifer,
replied Nancy. But they're both Neil stopped in mid-sentence.
Now open the door.
Neil looked at the door to Dr. Madalena's office and shook his head. This is crazy, he said. Do you know she's already thinking of filing criminal charges against you?
She stole something from me, and I want it back. Now open the door.
Neil hesitated for a moment and then unlocked the door with his master key. He stood guard outside while Nancy rifled the desk drawers.
They've got to be here,
she muttered, carelessly tossing aside books and papers as she searched for the deadly claw. Then she noticed the wall safe, its door slightly ajar. She crossed the room and threw open the door. Joey's head stared back at her, his eyes wide and glassy. He's got them back, said Joey as Nancy began to scream. Neil rushed to the safe and saw only a slight smear of blood. He turned around and saw Nancy racing down the hall toward the group therapy room. Nancy peeked into the room and saw that Dr. Madalena was leading the session herself. It was clear from the expression on her face that she was getting nowhere fast. Kincaid, said Dr. Madalena, singling out the boy whom she perceived as being the closest thing this motley group of disturbed adolescents had to a leader. Why don't you tell us what's been happening these past few days, Why don't you eat shit and die, suggested Kincaid. Dr. Madalena stared at him for a long moment and decided to try a different approach. Perhaps, she thought, one of the less aggressive children would be more inclined to cooperate. Taryn? The girl just shrugged and shook her head slowly from side to side. Everyone was silent. Anyone? Said Dr. Madalena in a tone of voice that clearly betrayed her mounting irritation. Well, she said, rising to her feet after a few painfully long seconds, if you'll excuse me, I believe I can find more constructive uses for my time. Nancy ducked into an open doorway as Dr. Madalena stormed down the hall. Every face in the room lit up when Nancy walked in a moment later. Welcome back, said Kincaid, a big grin on his face. I knew you wouldn't leave us, said Kristen, jumping from her seat to embrace her friend. The others followed Kristen's lead, and soon they were all crowding around Nancy, their faces glowing with renewed hope. She waited until they calmed down and then stepped back to speak.
It's time for the final battle,
said Nancy, all of a sudden sounding very much like a general addressing her troops. Just tell us what to do, said Kincaid. Nancy smiled at the boy and nodded. For once, Dr. Madalena's instincts had been right. If Kincaid cooperated, the others would follow. Ultimately, however, Nancy's secret weapon was Kristen Parker. Nancy herself was the seasoned veteran in this campaign, but Kristen alone held the power needed to stop the enemy dead in his tracks.
Come with me,
said Nancy, holding out her hands as she lay down in the center of the floor. One by one the others joined her, their heads in the center and their arms linked to form a star. At that moment Neil Guinness appeared in the doorway. Nancy called for him, extending a hand in invitation. Neil stopped, not knowing what to say or do. He looked out into the hall, imagining what Dr. Madalena would say if she walked in and found him lying on the floor with Nancy and the kids. Then he looked at Nancy, so sure of herself, so confident that what she was doing wasn't so crazy as it appeared to be. I love this crazy lady, he thought. suddenly tempted to follow her lead despite all of his professional instincts to do the contrary. Maybe Nancy was crazy as a loon, but she seemed to share some fundamental understanding with these kids. That had continued to elude him despite his persistent effort to get through to them. If Nancy had some way, however unorthodox, of helping them work out whatever it was that was troubling them, Neil very much wanted to be a part of it. But now, as he gazed into Nancy's eyes, he saw an intensity of purpose and vision that was truly terrifying. Wherever she was headed with these kids, Neil was not yet ready to go. Slowly, he shook his head no. Nancy nodded once and took a deep breath.
Kristen,
She said, forcing herself to dismiss Neil Guinness from her thoughts. Kristen nodded and closed her eyes. 10 seconds later, she was fast asleep. Neil watched and allowed himself a slight smile. So that's what this is all about, he thought. He had seen plenty of group meditations in his time, and hadn't been impressed. What he had never seen before, though, was 6 people disappear before his astonished eyes. It was, he had to admit, damned impressive. And then they were on Elm Street, standing before the house they had all seen before in their worst nightmares.
that is it.
She said.
This is where he was born.
She continued while feeling an exhilarating sense of power.
And this is where he has to die.
What's the plan? Asked Kristen.
We move in fast. We find the son of a bitch, and we take his weapon.
And then?
Asked Turin. Then we kill the motherfucker with his own fucking claws, said Kincaid.
Let's go.
Instructed Nancy.
And don't forget, stay together.
Turin was the last to enter the house. It wasn't that she was any more afraid than the others. Indeed, Turin was just as eager as any of them to get the battle underway. It was just her way to fall back and let others lead. All her life she had thought of herself as a follower. Her loyalty and courage were beyond reproach. Given a good cause, Turin always believed she would follow a strong leader into the gates of hell itself. And now she had. Turin was about to follow the others up the narrow staircase when she heard a familiar voice. "Sugar baby!" She stopped and turned around.
Grandma!
Unnoticed by the others, Turin strayed from the group and entered a small room that she had somehow overlooked before. A picture in an old-fashioned frame hung on the wall. Turin crossed the room and smiled. She had always loved that old photograph of herself as a baby, cradled in the strong arms of her loving grandmother. But what in the world was that picture doing? "Sugar baby!" Turin whirled around to see her grandmother, sitting in the big rocker that she always sat in when she was alive.
Grandma!
Said Turin, instinctively rushing into the old woman's loving arms. "I'm so glad you've come back," said the old woman, one strong arm around Turin's waist, while the other caressed her soft hair. "We were all just so worried when you ran away, little Turin."
I didn't run away, Grandma. I had these dreams, and then I had to go to the hospital.
She said. "I just missed you so much," said the woman in the rocking chair, as she tightened her grip on the girl's narrow waist.
Don't worry, Grandma. I'm never gonna leave you again.
Said Turin, feeling at peace for the first time in many months.
Oh, I know, dearie. In fact, you can bet your sweet ass on it.
Croaked Freddy Krueger, rocking contentedly as his gleaming blade sliced smoothly across the girl's screaming face. Chapter 8. In another reality, Neil Guinness lay in bed with his clothes on and turned off the light. This is crazy, he said aloud as he took a series of slow, deep breaths and tried to will himself to sleep. Neil pictured the old house on Elm Street in his mind, forcing the image of the abandoned house to stay uppermost in his consciousness even as he began to think about what he had seen at the hospital that day. People don't just disappear. That's what Dr. Madalena said, and for once, of course, she was right. Still, he had been there. He had seen... Well, what did he see? Maybe it had been a dream. Maybe this whole crazy thing was a dream. Maybe there was no Nancy Thompson, except in his fevered imagination. And maybe there was no Dr. Madalena and no Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital either. For that matter, maybe there was no Neil Guinness. Neil took another deep breath and forced his mind's eye to return to the old house on Elm. A line from Shakespeare drifted through his consciousness as he surrendered to the sweet drowsiness that was finally overtaking him. For in that sleep of death, what dreams may come. And then he was there. Neil stepped up onto the porch and knocked on the door. "Nancy?" He opened the door and was instantly enshrouded in a thick bluish fog. "Nancy!" he repeated cautiously. Then he stepped into the room. There was a mirror on the wall. Neil looked at his reflection and then took hold of his right cheek. Slowly he stretched it like taffy at arm's length, a grin of sheer delight on his distorted face. "I'm in," he whispered in awe as his face resumed its normal shape. "I'm in the dreamscape." Suddenly he heard a crashing noise from somewhere farther back in the house. He walked through the door at the end of the room and found himself submerged in total darkness. In another part of the house, Nancy searched for her missing comrades.
Taryn?
She called,
Kincaid? Laredo?
and then she saw him.
Missing your little friends?
He rasped, a crooked smile on his ugly face.
You son of a bitch!
She screamed, somehow knowing in that instant that Taryn was dead. Freddy laughed, raised his bladed glove, and took one menacing step forward. Nancy ducked as he swung out at her, and ran from the room as fast as she could, with Freddy always just a few steps behind. She ran through doorway after doorway down a seemingly endless maze of dimly lit corridors, before suddenly crashing into someone in the darkness.
Neil! What are you doing here?
She asked, more annoyed than relieved by his presence. Maybe she loved him, but this wasn't the world in which their love belonged. Nancy knew there were dangers here that Neil had literally never dreamed of before. "I had to come," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "Don't you understand what this means? I've been studying the dream state from the outside for years, and now I'm actually on the inside looking in. This is gonna make one hell of a paper."
You have to get out.
Said Nancy, shaking her head frantically from side to side.
You're in serious danger here.
"No, this is fantastic," said Neil, his entire body seeming to vibrate in tune to some unseen force. It's kind of like being inside some kind of incredible television,"
Stay tuned,
said Nancy.
because you're about to see something you've never seen on TV.
And then Freddy appeared twice as large as life, with his gleaming blades raised high for the kill.
Is there a doctor in the house?
He asked. Nancy grabbed Neil's hand and pulled him out of the room. "Let's get out of here," said Neil as they raced down a crooked corridor that seemed to get narrower and narrower the faster they ran.
Your dream or mine?
Asked Nancy, looking back to see Freddy gaining on them fast. She pulled Neil through the first open door she saw and almost tripped over the dismembered remains of Taryn and Joey. Nancy watched in grim silence as Neil turned away and vomited violently in the corner of the room. Laredo had lost the others around the corner of one of the countless meandering hallways they had been wandering since setting foot in this house. No matter, more than any of the others, Laredo felt at home in the world of dreams. Here at last was the ultimate manifestation of Dungeons and Dragons, with no dice or computer programs standing between the player and his wily opponent. This time the sword in Laredo's hand was a real one, forged from his own vivid imaginings. Laredo had never handled a real sword before, but he knew as soon as he grabbed the heavy hilt that this was the weapon he was born to wield. Cautiously, Laredo proceeded down a slippery staircase, ever aware that the devil can assume many forms. If his years of game playing had taught him anything, it was that underestimating your opponent's strength was the quickest route to defeat. "Rado?" Laredo whirled around, his eyes bright and his sword held high. "It's me, Rado. It's your brother Toby." The boy in the green and red striped bathing suit couldn't have been more than 7 years old. "You're not Toby," said Laredo, the sword shaking visibly in his hand. "Toby's dead." "You were supposed to keep an eye on me in the pool," said the boy. "If you hadn't answered the phone, I'd still be alive." "I was only gone for a second," said Laredo, his voice trembling almost imperceptibly. "A second was all I needed to drown. I'm sorry," whispered Laredo. How often had he wished he had never gone off to answer the telephone that terrible day. It was after Toby died that he'd begun to immerse himself in the world of fantasy, and then the dreams began. "Hold me, Rado," said the boy, extending his thin arms. "Hold me and everything will be okay." Laredo paused and took a deep breath and stepped forward. Suddenly his foot lashed out, landing squarely in the boy's crotch. Roaring with pain, Freddy Krueger lurched back and crashed into the wall behind him. "You didn't think I'd fall for the old shape-changing trick, did you?" asked Laredo, a triumphant smile on his face. "We Dream Warriors are too clever for that." Laredo paused as the implications of being a Dream Warrior slowly dawned on him. "All right," he said, mustering his concentration. "Let's try playing by your rules for a while." And then, before Freddy's eyes, the boy tossed aside his sword and metamorphosized into a fierce dragon with powerful claws and gleaming yellow eyes. Immediately, Freddy turned himself into a large black crow, flapping quickly out of reach, just as a tongue of flame shot out of the dragon's mouth, incinerating a nearby table. No sooner had the crow attacked the dragon's eyes with its sharp beak and claws than the serpent disappeared, only to be replaced by a huge red net that flung itself in the air and trapped the flapping bird. But then the bird was gone, and in its place was an oozing blob of protoplasm that quickly seeped through the close-knit mesh. And then the blob disappeared and Laredo resumed his normal form, poised for his opponent's next attack. But nothing happened. Freddy was gone. "I've won," Laredo whispered, hardly able to believe his own success. He took a deep, calming breath and closed his eyes for just a moment. But a second was all it took for Laredo's sword to fly up from the floor and pierce him through the heart. Suddenly, the floor opened up beneath his feet, and Laredo was sucked into a whirlpool of flames that instantly scorched his flesh to the bone. The floor itself laughing in triumph as the boy sank deeper and deeper into the all-consuming hellfire. And then there were 4. No one spoke for a long time as Nancy and Neil and Kristen and Kincaid faced each other in the living room of the old house on Elm Street. "Some Dream Warriors we turned out to be," said Kincaid at last. "We're alive, aren't we?" said Kristen.
And so is he.
Said Nancy. "Whatever he is," muttered Neil, heading for the front door. Suddenly the door slammed shut and the lights went off. Somebody screamed, and then the room was illuminated by an eerie green light. Freddy Krueger stood in the middle of the room, his talon-tipped hand extended in an obscene gesture of greeting.
"Welcome, my children,"
he croaked. "Fuck you," said Kincaid, spitting squarely into Freddy's right eye. As Freddy stepped back and wiped the thick glob of saliva from his face, Kincaid kicked him hard in the stomach and sent the startled creature crashing into the far wall.
Let's get out of here,
shouted Nancy, knowing that the 4 of them were not powerful enough to snatch the demon's claws. "Where do we go?" asked Kristen.
It's up to you.
Said Nancy.
You pulled us into your dream. Now you have to pull us out.
"What do I do?" asked the girl as Freddy slowly staggered to his feet.
Concentrate.
Said Nancy calmly.
Think of a place you know best and take us there.
Kristen looked into Nancy's eyes and nodded her head. She closed her eyes just as Freddy's claw lashed wildly through the thin air. There was a party going on at the Parker house, undeniably the social event of the year, according to the local society columnist. Anyone who is anyone will be there. Mrs. Parker was pleased. Even Jack Webster, the elusive thespian, who was rarely seen anywhere except on stage, had promised to put in a brief appearance. This was going to be the party that everyone at the country club would be talking about for a long time to come. Mrs. Parker was about to have a sharp word with an idle waiter when the telephone rang. "No, Dr. Madalena," said Mrs. Parker, more than a little annoyed that the woman had dared to call in the middle of her soiree. "I haven't seen Kristen." "Yes, I understand there's been some trouble over there." "Uh-huh. Quite frankly, Doctor, I would say that this is your problem and not mine. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have guests to attend to." She hung up the phone and returned to the living room. The waiter was now standing alone in the corner of the room, resting his tray on Mrs. Parker's favorite Chippendale chair and fingering the gilt frame on her recently acquired Monet. Or was it Manet? Mrs. Parker could never remember. In either case, it was extremely valuable, and the lazy clod was going to pay dearly for his impudence. Mrs. Parker was about to speak severely to the young man when Kristen, Nancy, Neil, and Kincaid appeared out of nowhere and crashed into the center of the crowded buffet table. Nancy scrambled to her feet and checked out her companions. Everyone seemed to be all right, except for a few minor scrapes and bruises. Kincaid had already snatched a handful of shrimp from a broken dish on the floor and was studying the house and its well-dressed occupants with admiring eyes. "Some party, yeah," he said. "Just what do you people think you're doing here?" asked Mrs. Parker, turning around just in time to see Kristen carefully stepping out of her mother's finest punch bowl. "You'll lose your license for this, young man," she said, pointing an accusing finger at Neil. "Mother," Kristen began. "I'll deal with you later, young lady," said Mrs. Parker. "Please go to your room immediately."
Too late,
said Nancy as the floor began to tremble. And then the room itself seemed to explode as Freddy erupted violently from the center of the floor with a scream of rage. Immediately, Mrs. Parker stepped forward to chastise her uninvited guest. "Just who do you think—" Before she could finish her question, however, Freddy lashed out and slashed the woman across the stomach. As Mrs. Parker looked down in horror at her exposed bowels, Freddy plunged his head into the woman's midsection and began to devour her still-throbbing viscera.
Next course!
Croaked Freddy, blood and guts dripping from his chin. Nancy grabbed Kristen and literally dragged her out of the room. Neil and Kincaid followed close behind.
it's just a dream.
Nancy assured the hysterical girl, although she knew perfectly well that they no longer dwelled in the world of dreams. What was done from here on in could not be undone. There would be time later for Kristen to mourn her mother as Nancy had once mourned hers. For now there were battles to be fought and powerful enemies to be vanquished. At least they had finally lured the demon onto their own turf. Nancy was beginning to wonder if that hadn't been a terrible mistake. As Nancy and her friends fled, Freddy followed close behind, slashing wildly at the frantic guest, leaving a trail of gore in his wake. Kristen had taken the lead now, steering the others around the corner and into her father's trophy room.
Holy shit!
Said Kincaid, looking around in amazement as Kristen locked the door behind them. One wall of the den was lined with mounted animal heads, souvenirs of Mr. Parker's many hunting trips to the African plains. On the opposite wall was a case containing more guns than Kincaid had seen in all his years on the mean streets of the inner city.
Give me the key!
Demanded Kincaid. I don't know where he keeps it, said Kristen.
Damn!
Kincaid started rummaging wildly through the metal cabinet next to the window. Meanwhile, Nancy had walked over to the glass-encased gun rack and tried the door.
It's not locked.
She said, swinging open the door. Daddy must have been showing his collection to one of the guests, said Kristen. Kincaid brushed past the girl, took a vintage submachine gun out of the case, and held it lovingly in his arms. Be careful, said Neil. That thing might be loaded. It probably doesn't even have a firing pin, said Kincaid. Just then, Freddy's metal claw ripped through the wooden door. Kincaid wheeled around, aimed the weapon, and squeezed the trigger. The door exploded in a blizzard of wood chips as the volley of bullets sent Freddy flying back into the hallway.
Let's get out of here,
said Nancy, knowing perfectly well that it was going to take more than bullets to stop Freddy Krueger. Where are we going? Asked Kristen.
You're the driver,
said Nancy.
Everyone link hands.
Neil looked annoyed. This is no time for...
Tell it to him,
said Nancy. Neil looked at the enraged creature crashing through the splintered wooden door and quickly joined the circle. Get us out of here, Kristen. I'm scared, said the girl. Just concentrate, said Dr. Neil. Kristen closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then the door caved in, and a bloody Fred Krueger clawed madly at the air, where a moment before had stood the 4 remaining Dream Warriors. Chapter 9. It had been a very long week for Dr. Madalena. First, Kristen Parker tried to kill herself. Then that strange Thompson girl came around and started stirring up trouble. Those nice children, Philip and Jennifer, had their dreadful accidents, and that awful Kincaid became even more abusive than usual. And just when things seemed about as bad as they could get, the entire lot of them disappear, and Neil Guinness swears that he saw them vanish in front of his eyes. And now Dr. Guinness himself was missing. Dr. Madalena had worked long and hard to establish herself and her hospital in the community, and she wasn't about to see all of her hard work go down the drain just because Neil Guinness had the hots for some little tramp like Nancy Thompson. Still, if Guinness and the kids didn't show up soon, she would have no choice but to call in the police. As much as she wanted to avoid a scandal, Dr. Madalena almost hoped that Neil Guinness would turn out to be responsible for all of this, so she could have the distinct personal pleasure of sending his highly respected ass to jail. And as she savored that thought, a square hole in space suddenly opened up in the middle of the room, and Neil, Nancy, and Kristen tumbled through.
Where's Kincaid?
Asked Nancy, ignoring the flustered Dr. Madalena. Help me! They all turned to see Kincaid stuck exactly halfway through the square. One half of his body in the hospital, and the other half back at Kristen's house. He's coming! The boys shouted. Get me out of here, please!
Come on!
Yelled Nancy. Neil and Kristen joined her in pulling on Kincaid's arm and leg.
You too!
Ordered Nancy, turning to Dr. Madalena. The older woman hesitated for just a moment and then joined the others. He's got my leg! He's got my leg! Screamed Kincaid, twitching wildly. Do something! Do something, please!
Concentrate, Kristen.
Gasped Nancy.
Pull him in.
I'm trying, said Kristen. It's just not working. And then Kincaid began to scream, first like a person in great pain, and then like nothing human anyone had ever heard. Kristen was crying now, and even Dr. Madalena was feeling something vaguely akin to compassion. They watched helplessly as the blood began to spurt from somewhere behind the square, 4 razor-sharp blades poking through and slowly working their way up the screaming boy's body. Then the blades reached his throat and the screaming abruptly stopped. Everyone stepped back as one side of Kincaid's body, raggedly sheared down the center, slid down the square like a specimen squirming on a lab slide before crashing to the floor. It was Dr. Madalena who began to scream now, as the head and torso of Freddy Krueger pushed through the strange hole in the fabric of reality. Freddy's mad laughter was the last sound she heard before the creature lashed out with his bloody claw and neatly sliced her head off. Are we dreaming or awake? asked Neil, gasping for breath as he followed the fleeing Nancy and Kristen out into the hospital corridor.
There's no difference anymore,
shouted Nancy, desperately searching for an escape route. Then at the end of the hallway she saw a door she had never noticed before. Without hesitation, she flung it open and began racing down the long flight of stairs that lay behind. The others followed, running as fast as they could, Freddy's claws scraping horribly along the metal railing a few steps behind them. After what seemed like hours of endless running, the breathless warriors arrived at a weathered wooden door. Nancy opened the door and pushed Neil and Kristen inside. No sooner had she slammed it shut behind them than Freddy's claw ripped through from the other side. "We're back on Elm Street," said Kristen calmly, her capacity for surprise long ago used up. Nancy looked around and saw that the upper level of the old house was a sea of flames. She turned back to the door just as Freddy burst through. Suddenly, Neil stepped forward, bravely positioning himself between Freddy and the girls. The brilliant young Dr. Guinness had a plan. "Get out of here!" he shouted to the surprised-looking creature. "This is my dream, you ugly son of a bitch! Nobody comes in here without my permission! Understand? Nobody!" Freddy stopped and stared at Neil in amazement.
"You're crazier than I am,"
he said, lashing out with his left arm and flicking Neil aside like a pesky mosquito. Neil crashed into the opposite wall and lay unconscious on the floor.
"And now, my darlings,"
said Freddy, grinning wickedly at the girls as he beckoned to them with his glistening talons. Nancy and Kristen looked around and saw no way out.
Call shoot,
whispered Nancy. Kristen gave her a puzzled look and then closed her eyes. Nancy turned around and saw the open coal chute appear on the wall behind them. Without hesitating, she grabbed the younger girl's hand and pulled her through. The chute twisted and wound in the darkness as the two girls plummeted over downward, landing at last on a pile of filthy rags. Even before she opened her eyes, Nancy felt the steamy air and heard the relentless pounding of the machinery.
We're in his boiler room,
she said.
This is where all the killing began.
And this is where it will end, she added to herself. Suddenly, Freddy popped out from behind the surging furnace.
"Welcome home, Nancy,"
he said. Grabbing a large pipe wrench, Kristen unhesitantly stepped between Freddy and her friend. Freddy just laughed and knocked the heavy tool out of her hand with the swipe of his gloved fist. He took a step forward and licked his blackened lips as if better to savor his long-awaited triumph. And then Nancy remembered a lesson she had learned long ago.
We're doing this all wrong,
she said, turning to Kristen with a slight smile on her face.
You can't fight a demon with fear and anger.
"Shut up,"
said Freddy, glaring furiously at Nancy.
Kruger feeds on hatred.
She continued.
He always has. It's the terror he creates, and all of us, that's let him live as long as he has.
"I'm warning you, bitch! Stop it now!"
said the creature as Nancy turned her puzzled friend 180 degrees. What are you doing? Asked Kristen.
The only way to fight a monster like Freddy is to turn your back on him.
Freddy backed off, a look of genuine fear on his twisted features as Nancy began to chant.
Freddy is nothing. Freddy is nothing.
Black smoke began to rise from Freddy's charred flesh as Kristen picked up the chant. Freddy is nothing. Freddy is nothing. Freddy is nothing. He stood paralyzed in one spot as the girls began to adapt their short refrain to a simple childlike tune. Nancy began to smile, almost relaxing as she started to wonder what all the fuss had been about in the first place. And then, with a cry of anguish, Kruger burst into flames, running aimlessly around the vast room as the girls ducked for cover behind a massive boiler. Kristen peeked out and saw nothing. Is he?
I don't know,
said Nancy. She stepped out and looked around. On the floor was a single glistening steel blade. She picked it up and grabbed it tightly in her clenched fist. Nancy, called a tired male voice. Nancy looked into the darkness and saw...
Neil!
Nancy ran toward the man in the mist. She wanted so much to believe that the nightmare was over at last. The man extended his arms and Nancy moved closer. It would be so wonderful if it were true, if this man who looked and sounded and acted like her beloved Neil were really who he claimed to be. If only wishes could come true. Nancy waited until she was in the man's arms and then plunged the steel blade deep into his chest.
Die, you son of a bitch!
Said Nancy, pulling off Freddy's mask as he swept upward with his carefully concealed glove, trying to pull away, even as Nancy tightened her death's grip, twisting the creature's own blade deeper and deeper into his heart.
No! You bitch!
And then she felt his blades enter her chest, and she knew that only a few moments were left for her to do what needed to be done. Ignoring her own terrible pain, Nancy pulled the blades out of her chest and wrenched the dreadful glove off Freddy's burnt and withered hand. With a cry of triumph, she tossed the bloody weapon to Kristen. Without a moment's hesitation, Kristen slipped the glove onto her own right hand. Immediately she felt a power unlike anything she had known before. With a scream of rage, she rushed at the demon of her nightmares and slashed his throat from ear to ear with his own razor-sharp blades.
Double!
And then, to be sure, Kristen pulled off the glove and plunged the blades directly into the creature's merciless heart. Freddy screamed and collapsed to the floor, his image seeming to flicker on and off like the picture of a poorly tuned television. Kristen freed Nancy from the demon's embrace and pulled her away from the rapidly fading creature.
He's dying.
Whispered Nancy. Kristen cradled her in her arms.
His house is burning, and his energy is almost gone. The nightmare is over.
Don't talk, said Kristen, holding her tighter. She could hardly see Freddy now as she peered into the darkness. Nancy pulled her closer and whispered one last request in her ear. Don't worry, said Kristen, nodding her head in agreement as tears filled her eyes. I won't let you die. I'm gonna dream you into a beautiful dream forever. Both girls closed their eyes. Nancy smiled a smile of great peace and slowly began to fade away. When Kristen opened her eyes, she was alone. Kristen stood up and walked slowly to the spot on which Freddy Krueger had stood a few short moments before. On the floor were a pile of ashes and 4 razor-sharp blades. Kristen wrapped the blades in a dirty rag and slipped them into her jacket pocket, and then she was back in the basement of the burning house. Neil lay unconscious on the floor. Calmly, Kristen threw open the cellar doors to let in the crisp, clean evening air. With greater strength than she had ever known before, Kristen dragged Neil up the stairs and into the clear, starry night. Chapter 10. Spring came early the following year. The epidemic of teenage suicides had come to an abrupt halt, and many people naively credited the change in climate with having contributed to the sudden upswing in the spirit of the local young people. The new staff at Weston Hills kept silent, pleased by the turn of events, but unwilling to put forth any theory of their own. Neil Guinness and Kristen Parker, meeting together for the first time in many months, carefully avoided the subject as well. I'm glad everything worked out for you, said Neil, sitting across from Kristen at his dining room table. I think New York was just what I needed, the girl replied. So many people I never have to feel alone. Besides, I really need to get away for a while after... She hesitated, still not ready to put into words the unbelievable events of the previous year. Well, I needed to get away after what happened, she concluded. I know what you mean, said Neil, who had not seen any patients since the day Nancy died. He had tried writing a paper on the long chain of events that had led to her death, but he knew even before he began that no reputable journal would ever publish A Nightmare on Elm Street. Perhaps it's better that way, he thought. Perhaps the world was not yet ready for the true story of Freddy Krueger. There was a long pause in the conversation, and then Kristen asked the question she had been waiting all evening to ask. Do you two still see each other? Neil reddened slightly and smiled. "I've been meaning to thank you for that," he said. "As a matter of fact, I'm seeing her tonight." "Say hi for me, okay?" said Kristen as she rose to leave. "I'll do that," said Neil, now more eager than ever to get to sleep and meet once again with the girl of his dreams. Kristen was walking toward the front door when she noticed the model house on Neil's mantel. "They were going to throw it out," he explained with a shrug. "I decided to save it as sort of a souvenir." Kristen studied the model for just a moment and then turned away with a grim smile. "Well, good night," she said, kissing Neil on the cheek as the two surviving dream warriors fondly embraced. "Good night, Kristen. I hope you'll visit again soon." "I will," she said. "Sweet dreams." "Thanks. Thanks to you," he said. He watched her walk down the porch steps and then close the door behind her. Alone again. He turned off the downstairs light and climbed the stairs to the bedroom. Soon Neil would be fast asleep, expecting momentarily to step into Nancy's warm and loving embrace. He never noticed the light blinking on in the window of the tiny house on the mantel, or heard the faint scraping of steel against steel in the miniature boiler room below. Epilogue: The Life and Death of Freddy Krueger. Freddy Krueger was born amidst a raging fire in the old insane asylum on Elm Street, the bastard son of a beautiful young schizophrenic who died alone and unattended in the agony of childbirth. In later years, Freddy would distinctly remember his mother's screams of pain as the first sounds he ever heard. Raised from infancy by a succession of axe murderers, rapists, and arsonists, young Freddy was adopted at an early age by a lonely old pimp who hoped that the strange-looking boy might someday make himself useful by luring curious drunks into the filthy alley in which his disease-ridden whores earned their meager pay. Whenever the old man would catch his adopted son enjoying the services of one of his employees, he would express his displeasure by beating the boy almost to the point of unconsciousness with the razor strop. It did not take young Freddy long to begin associating sexual pleasure with the infliction of pain. Occasionally, the old man would punish Freddy for some imaginary offense by drawing blood from his belly with a straight razor. Refusing to cry out loud no matter how badly his sadistic father slashed him, the boy began to take a perverse sort of pleasure in fingering the narrow scars that soon covered the front of his body. As a young man, Freddy showed no more aptitude as a pimp than the old man showed as a father. Finding the boy to be of no practical use, the old pimp paid no attention to him whatsoever, except when doling out his daily punishment. After a while, Freddy began almost to welcome the beatings, which were the only expression of parental interest he was ever to know. Freddy finally decided to run away after being savagely beaten by his father and left for dead in the alley. Before he left, Freddy used the money he found in the old man's strongbox to hire a professional arsonist to torch his house, while the old pimp slept peacefully upstairs. Freddy never bothered to find out whether the old man survived that blaze. With no formal schooling and no particular skills or aptitudes, Freddy wandered from town to town doing odd jobs and getting into trouble with the law. He began to drink heavily and spent many nights sleeping in the gutter. Freddy was sleeping in an alley near the local schoolhouse when a group of young boys decided to try picking the drunk's pockets. One boy's hand was still in his pocket when Freddy awoke in a drunken rage and lashed out wildly with the bottle of gin clenched in his hand. The bottle landed on the boy's head with a loud crash as his four companions fled in terror. Freddy watched the boys run away and then looked thoughtfully at the child who was bleeding to death beside him in the alley.
They're scared of me.
He thought, strangely exhilarated as never before by the unfamiliar feeling of power that surged through his body like a shot of adrenaline. Freddy carried the bleeding boy to a deserted cellar and studied his figure for a long time.
Children are useless,
he thought, repeating a sentiment he had often heard muttered by the old man who raised him.
Children are better off dead,
he thought, improvising freely on the theme. He reached into his pocket and took out the straight razor he had taken from the old man's closet before leaving home. Freddy roughly tore off the boy's clothing and studied his smooth white belly for a moment. Then, recalling the 4 boys who escaped, Freddy cut 4 deep incisions into the boy's flesh. He watched for a while as the blood spurted out, his face flushed with triumph. For the first time in his life, Freddy Krueger was in control. It was a feeling he did not want to live without ever again. Freddy continued his nomadic existence until he arrived at the suburban community of Springwood. There was something about Springwood that instantly outraged him. Perhaps it was the well-cared-for lawns and lovely tree-lined streets that were so much more beautiful than anything he had ever dreamed of as a child. Or perhaps it was the carefree children of Springwood, so blissfully unaware of the suffering and anguish of the real world. Suddenly, Freddy knew his calling in life. He would teach these smug suburbanites and their children what the world was really all about. He would teach them the true meaning of pain. For the first time in his life, Freddy looked for a regular job, and he soon found one maintaining the boiler in the old generating plant on the outskirts of town. The work was easy enough, and it left Freddy with plenty of time to devote to his true calling. He soon decided that his old straight razor was insufficient to do the holy work that needed to be done. Freddy spent many hours in the machine shop, forging the deadly tool he would need to carry out his mission. These were among the happiest hours of his life, designing and then building the special glove with its 4 deadly finger blades. Carefully, with a feeling akin to love, Freddy cut the gleaming metal, honing it to a fine razor-sharp edge, and then fitting the assembled apparatus into the fingerless leather glove. Then, when it was finally done, he took a deep breath and slipped the deadly talons onto his hand.
A perfect fit!
And now it was time to put his creation to the test. The next day, Freddy slipped into his comfortable red and green sweater, donned his crumpled fedora, climbed into the front seat of his battered Chevy van, and drove into town. Lovingly, he clicked the blades that gleamed so beautifully on his right hand and waited patiently in the alley adjacent to Springwood Elementary School. He felt his muscles tense with excitement as the bell rang, announcing the end of another school day. For a fleeting moment, Freddy wondered what it would have been like to have gone to school with other children, to have had friends to have played the innocent games of childhood with. For that one brief moment, Freddy wondered if it might not be terribly wrong to interfere with the normal development of a child, to cut off at its very beginnings a human life of almost infinite possibilities and potentialities. Then he saw the children, laughing and skipping as they rushed into their parents' loving arms, and Freddy knew what he had to do. There was a little girl standing at the curb, not far from that alley. Perhaps her mother had had difficulty starting the car, or maybe a long line at the supermarket had set her schedule back a few minutes.
No matter.
The little girl was very much alone, and Freddy felt a stirring deep in his wicked soul. Squinting into the sunlight, he read the name Amy written in bright pink letters on the girl's lunchbox.
Amy,
He whispered, but the girl didn't seem to hear him.
Amy.
He repeated, a little louder this time. The girl looked at him with her large blue eyes.
Come here.
He said, beckoning to the girl with his left hand. She looked away for a moment, glancing up the street, as if expecting her mother to arrive at any moment. Then she looked back at Freddy, and he knew in that instant that he had won.
Come here.
He repeated. The girl hesitated for only a moment, and then stepped into the alley. Who are you? She asked in a small, sweet voice that set Freddy's teeth on edge.
Uncle Freddy.
He replied, liking the sound of it.
Your mother said I should bring you home.
The girl looked at him and shook her head doubtfully. I don't have an Uncle Freddy, she said.
You do now,
said Freddy, raising his right hand high into the air. Then he brought it down, his temples pounding as his left hand covered the child's mouth and his right tore 4 deadly gashes into her soft belly. Freddy looked at the bloodied glove for a moment and felt joy deep in his soul. How easily the little one had died. He lifted the girl's bloody body and carried it quickly to his parked van, feeling more alive than he had ever felt before. He stashed the body under some blankets in the back of the van and drove to the power plant. There, he unloaded the body and hid it in a large, unused storage locker in the back of the boiler room. Then he sat back and breathed deeply of the hot, stifling boiler room air that he had learned to love. At last, Freddy's life had meaning. After that, Freddy found it easy to fulfill his self-proclaimed destiny. His methods of abduction varied, but the result was always the same. He loved to see the newspaper accounts of the kidnappings, but it troubled him that no one knew for certain whether the missing children were dead. He began leaving puddles of blood at the murder sites so that everyone would know that these were no mere kidnappings. It was important to him that the smug parents of Springwood know that their children were being carefully and methodically butchered. Freddy soon learned that leaving evidence around was not the wisest course for a murderer to pursue. One morning, a small squadron of police led by the intrepid Lieutenant Thompson burst into the power plant and found the rotting bodies of the town's murdered children. Freddy was arrested and brought to trial amid great publicity. Fortunately for Freddy, however, the public defender who handled the case was extremely thorough in his preparation. He examined the search warrant that had gained the police admittance to the power plant the day they arrested Freddy, and found a technical error in the wording of the document. The search was ruled illegal, and the case against Freddy was thrown out of court. Despite public outcry, the Springwood slasher was set free. It was time to move on, and Freddy knew it. There would be other towns and other children. Next time, Freddy vowed, he would not be so easy to catch. That night, Freddy packed his meager belongings into the back of his van and settled in for one last night's sleep before hitting the road. He had just settled into a cozy corner of the boiler room with a bottle of his favorite gin when he heard the commotion outside. The angry people of Springwood, led by Lieutenant Don Thompson and his wife Marge, had decided to take the law into their own hands. It was the Thompsons and their Elm Street neighbors, the Lances, who poured the gasoline around the power plant, and it was the Grays and the Lanes who set the fuel afire. Never again would their children, Nancy, Glenn, Tina, Rod, and all the others, be terrorized by the wicked Fred Krueger. They smiled grimly as the power plant began to burn, and someone in the mob applauded when Freddy appeared in the doorway, his red and green sweater burning brightly in the night. Even as the flames consumed his flesh, Freddy could be heard cursing the mob and screaming his vows of revenge. Then, with one last cry of agony, the burning figure turned from the crowd and raced madly into the very flames that were devouring him. The body was never found. "Guess we've seen the last of Fred Krueger," said Marge Thompson that night, breathing a deep sigh of relief as she examined Freddy's blood-caked finger knives with a mixture of disgust and ill-concealed fascination. But Marge was wrong. Freddy would be back, and the nightmare was just about to begin. Okay, Slashaholics, the end. This has been A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, the novelization by Jeffrey Cooper. Gotta say, going into this, I had heard it was a bit different. I didn't realize it was completely different than the movie, but that's okay. It's not, I've heard it's not exactly the same as Wes Craven's original script, but it's kind of like a amalgam of the original script and the script that ended up being the movie that we all know and love, The Dream Warriors. Usually these novelizations have a few little differences here and there, but it was kind of cool to get a totally alternate universe type feel for the Dream Warriors story with this novelization. I really enjoyed it. I really did. I was let down a few times, kind of like with the whole Phil scene. We didn't have the whole puppet thing happen. That was a disappointment. But the deaths that we did get, other than his, which was kind of, he just got thrown out into traffic. The other ones in the dreamscapes and the dream worlds and everything, I thought they were very vivid, very terrifying. The kills were pretty brutal for this short book. And thankfully, Dr. Madalena got her head cut clean the fuck off. I had to stop recording for a second when that happened and jump for joy because If you'd been listening to the playlist version of this book where I do a chapter per upload, I kept saying, I hope she gets hers, I hope she gets hers, in my end upload review of the chapters. And she sure enough did. She lost her head over the whole deal. And I was happy for that. I did enjoy Neil's little confrontation with Freddy towards the end of the book, where Freddy just like knocks him out of the way. He's all like, "You're crazier than I am." I love that part. I really thought it was cool that Nancy dug back into the climax of the original movie with the whole turning her back to Freddy. I guess Freddy was just playing possum, though, because he came back as Neil shortly after. The scene was very reminiscent of Nancy's death scene in Dream Warriors, but instead of her dad and the whole burying the skeleton and sacred, whatever, at the junkyard, it was Freddy was trying to trick her as Neil, and it was awesome that Nancy saw right through that and was like, "Fuck you, Freddy." So I really enjoyed that scene. I enjoyed all the stuff with Kristen, snapping them in and out of her dream, in and out of existence, in and out of reality. That was pretty cool. I loved that it happened right in front of Dr. Madalena. I love the character of Laredo. I know they changed his name from the movie, but it was basically the same character, the Dungeons and Dragons guy. I enjoyed his showdown with Freddy in the dream world a lot more in the book than I did in the movie, because in the movie it's like all that build-up and his shooting the magic missiles just doesn't do nothing in the movie. And they took out the whole wheelchair thing, and he had a badass fight with Freddy. He's like turning into a dragon, then turning into a net. Freddy's turning into a giant bird. It was just awesome, very vivid, very cool. Enjoyed the hell out of that. I enjoyed Nancy digging into Freddy's past, and we got a different origin story for Freddy in the book compared to the movie. It wasn't as cool. It wasn't like the bastard son of 100 maniacs, but it was still a pretty cool backstory. Her getting to go talk to that old nun and everything. I thought the conclusion was cool, that Neil and Nancy are still seeing each other in his dreams. That was pretty sweet and everything. Kristen's moving on. Of course, we got the ending with the little the light and the little miniature house lighting up, which makes a lot more sense now than it did in the movie. At least in my opinion, it does. But I mean, Joey and Kincaid are dead, and there is a novelization of Part 4 that I'm going to be reading pretty soon. And if it goes strictly by the movie, then it's going to be kind of weird for people listening to the novelizations here on the channel to go from this to that. But it's just because when this book came out, the Dream Warriors was still being produced, and the script went through a lot of changes. That's why the novelization ended up the way it did. There was probably a lot of budget constraints, and they had to change stuff from the script that the author of this book was probably working off of. And I really thought the epilogue, the life and death of Freddy Krueger, it's just such a different backstory than we're used to. At least most of it is. But at the same time, it was really intriguing. Now, as a father of a 10-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old son, it was a bit hard for me to read some of that. But, we all know what Freddy was before he was burnt to death, and came back as the Freddy Krueger we know from the nightmares. So, that was his backstory. I can't wait to hear all of y'all's thoughts on that epilogue, that whole life and death of Freddy Krueger, this different alternate version of Freddy's origin story. Because that's something all in itself that I would love to go into more detail about. And whenever I get to this book, when me and Sean Campbell on the Out of Print Slashers podcast have the Dream Warriors book as our discussion topic in the future on one of the episodes, I will go into more detail and dissect that whole life and death epilogue thing of Freddy Krueger. But it was just cool to have that alternate take on his history. And I want to hear from you guys what you thought of the book, what you thought of that epilogue, and if you're looking forward to my narrations of Part 2, 4, and 5 in the Nightmare on Elm Street novelization series. Until then, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and as always,
Pleasant dreams!
Of the night, with tales of horrific might, slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night. Lies and masks and pain, blood runs like the rain. Evil finds its way in the spine-chilling fray. Out of breath but not out of light. Holidays, don't look behind. Feel the terror crave. Will you dare to slave? I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night. Unabridged, but not out of mind. Aurora digs, don't look behind. Feel the terror crave. Will you dare to slay? I'm a slashaholic, addicted to the fright. Narration so hypnotic, Josh keeps me up all night. Final destination's near. Every death's a newfound fear. Pulled to madness year by year. Josh's words I always hear.